Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. And let's begin. So I drove out to my grandpa's barn the other day to grab my brother's wallet. He'd left it there by accident. This was at about 9 p.m. I would guess. And while I was grabbing my brother's wallet, I just had a feeling like I was being watched. A bit of detail too. About a mile between my house and the barn is a culvert. It's before a large hill with a curve about halfway through. You have to slow down to avoid a possible accident. I slowed down to a crawl on this back road, and when I did, there were these two kids on the road. Now I try to be a good-natured redneck, so I stopped to see what they were doing and if they needed help. I had heard these stories growing up about weird stuff happening on this road. Everything from ghost lights to even a woman who apparently asks for a ride and screams if you say yes before disappearing. But this was different. I stopped and asked these kids if they were okay. I mean, it's summer, and maybe they'd been out riding four-wheelers or something and they got wrecked or broke down or whatever. One kid asked for a ride, but his voice was just, I don't know, weird. Too calm, and he didn't make eye contact either. I looked at the other. I live in the deep south where the mosquito is the state bird, and the other kid was just covered in mosquitoes. Didn't swat them or anything. So I finally asked him, "Why are you looking down like that, man?" He then looks up, and I swear to you that his eyes were black as coal. I stomped the gas as hard as I could, soaring up the hill, barely making the curve. They both stared at me as I zipped up the road, flinging gravel and dust everywhere. I got out of there as quickly as I could, and I didn't sleep very well that night. I live around a small town in Kentucky, out in the boonies. Behind me is 1,000 plus acres of pure woods, hardly any clear patches in fact. There's an old house or barn. It's about maybe 20 minutes hike from my house. And well, I got bored and grabbed my Garand and started to the house. I finally find the house as I take a quick break. House is probably maybe 75 meters from me. I'm pretty hidden if you were to look out from the house and look in my general direction. I'm smoking a quick cigarette, and I hear my name in a beautiful female voice, sort of like sing-songing. Instantly I get up, gun in ready position. I'm ready for whatever is about to go down, and I'm here just listening and looking. Birds are still chirping, bugs are still buzzing, so I'm like, okay, I must have just imagined that. Whatever. So I started walking to the house. I'm on the front porch, but before I head in, I leave a cigarette on the porch. I was always taught that going into an abandoned house in the woods, that you always leave a gift. Also, this is my very first time finding the house and being inside of it. So I walk in, and honestly, for a house built in the early maybe 1910 to 20s, it was in pretty decent shape. I spend maybe, I don't know, like 20 minutes in the downstairs floors, and I start going upstairs, and my body froze, and I heard my name again, but it sounded like it was on the porch now. At this point, I'm getting a really odd feeling. I'm already halfway up the stairs though, so I say to heck with it, and keep going. I walked around upstairs, found a window with a really good view, spent a few minutes enjoying it, and I felt this cold, cold presence on the back of my head, as well as with a hand on my shoulder. I instantly turned around and there was nothing behind me, but I heard small running footsteps that went down the hall, and sounded like out the door, followed by a little girl's laughter. When I say that I ran like a bat out of hell, that is an understatement. Full-blown running, gun in my hands, I hauled but through the woods, and I get a good 100 meters away. I'm completely out of breath. It's about 10:30 in the morning. I left at about 8:30ish. I begin smoking another cigarette on a log, and I'm hearing the birds chirping, etc. At this point, I'm like, good, keep chirping. I start heading home, and I was walking a pace that I like to call, I'm scared, but I ain't trying to look like a pace. I get about 200 meters from my house. Last obstacle is a creek. I'm on a steep hill to the right, overlooking the creek, and for whatever reason, something in me said stop and look around. At this moment, I realize that there's no birds. Not even the stupid bugs are making noise now. It was so quiet that I could hear my blood flowing through my ears. I heard something down the creek too. I poke over the Civil War fence to see what's down below, and it's just a single buck standing there. Alright, well, all that for a buck. I start walking down to the creek, when this thing stood on its hind legs and bowed, before taking off on all fours through the woods. It was at this point that I began a nice jog back home. The following night, I heard my name again from the woods, around 3 a.m. At this point, I yelled a very subtle get lost. The dog's gotta pee though, which is why I had to go outside at 3 a.m. by the way. But I haven't heard it since. and it's been 5 years since then. I still go to the house every now and then, and never had the same experience. Personally, I really don't know what touched me, let alone breathed down the back of my neck like that, but it definitely was stalking me, whatever it was. There are a few more other stories from those woods that maybe I'll tell another time, but this one always creeps me out whenever I share it. I just got back home from shopping and was parking my car. I was just about to open my door when for some reason I had an off feeling. I looked to my left and saw a woman with a hood standing a few feet away from me. When she saw me, she stopped walking towards me and backed up a few steps. I pretended to look through my purse, hoping that she would know that I'd seen her and that she would leave. She then went and hid behind my truck, so I couldn't see her any longer. My car doors are locked, but I didn't know what side she was on. I waited for about 2 more minutes, and then I saw her run a few feet to the corner and hide beside a house. I kept looking back, and kept seeing her peek her head out to see if I'd got out of the car yet. I called my dad, and I asked if he could come to the car and help me walk home. He came running down the street with a bat, and the woman left running. The moral of this story is always be aware of your surroundings. If I didn't look to my left, I would have been robbed, or maybe even worse. Also, I now carry something with me in my hand any time I'm getting out of the car. The first 18 years of my life, I thought that aliens were some wild conspiracy cooked up by fringe believers, with some type of mental health disorder overlay, and possibly drug abuse issues as well. But then, the summer of 2001 happened, and I had to forget everything that I thought I knew about this phenomenon. My 2 friends and I headed up to the Canadian border. We wanted to head over into Montreal for gambling, hookers, and cocaine, but they were still too young for that, and not yet 18. So instead, we spent a few nights in a border town. We were sitting on the porch of the house that we were staying in, dead sober. It was hardly even midnight, and I was just gazing at the stars. We were talking about girls and what we needed to do with our lives. I started staring at this one star, or meteor, because it just didn't seem to be following the laws of physics, and what I've come to expect from shooting stars or planets. And I got this, I don't know, like compulsion or a kind of feeling that I'd never felt before. I stood up, jumped over the railing, and began running toward the train tracks. I remember running with a focused goal and intent, but still thinking to myself, why am I doing this? I think I heard my friends yelling behind me, but listening to them did not get me up the stony hill any faster, and that thought just fell by the wayside. I remember scrambling up the rocks on all fours, and my fingertips just gently dancing across the stones. I made it to the middle of the tracks, and stared up at this star. My 2 friends came running up behind me after some time, and they're out of breath. They ask what I'm doing. I don't really have a response, and I'm just staring. I don't even think that I turned my head, to be honest. I was just fascinated by this thing. I don't want to say that I was paralyzed, but I was certainly enthralled and compelled to just keep staring. I remember raising my hand to point at the star, and before my finger could finish pointing at it in a straight line, the craft was suddenly above us. And it was strange, too. It wasn't as if this thing went from being a shooting star or meteor-type deal and zipped across the sky, nor did it teleport. It moved from point A to point B just so quickly, and it was maybe 20 feet, 30 feet above us. There were no windows or lights. It was a solid, quicksilver-type disk that appeared to have a shifting surface. It did not disrupt the air like a helicopter. There was no dust from the crushed rocks or shaking of the nearby trees or anything. It was just very far away, and then suddenly very close. I remember being startled that there wasn't a gust of air or screeching of brakes or some kind of thrusters to make it stop. It was really odd. One friend started shaking his head and started walking away with his arms straight down at his sides and his head facing forward and away and saying, "This is not real. I am dreaming. This cannot be real," and walked back to the house and just never talked about it again. The other friend and I stood there for what felt like 5 seconds, but also 5 minutes. I said something to the effect of, "I want to believe it's not real, but I mean it's right there." We exchanged just very basic disbelief statements that came out very calmly and logically, but in hindsight were indicative of some type of shock. The craft didn't seem to do anything. We didn't see any aliens, we weren't abducted as far as I know, and very fortunately, we weren't on any drugs. I think I would have lost my mind completely had we been tripping or something, but it just sits with me weird because it's a rather uneventful encounter, like nothing really happened. But also we saw a ship that was not from this world. I mean, how could it be? We don't even have drones like this today, and it's like 22 years later. It had some type of interest in us, or it never would have come close to us, I guess. but all it did was leave. No tractor beams, no searing lights, no radiation burns or missing organs or anything. Maybe I just had high hopes that seeing a craft this close meant that aliens and answering all the world's questions or whatever was about to happen, but it still sits really strangely with me all this time later, somewhere between the holy cow feeling and just a general lack of fulfillment. I consider myself lucky and blessed to have witnessed this, but again, no green men, no army response, no F-15s screeching across the sky or anything. It just seemed to stop by to say hi, and then was gone. It's such a weird experience that I still don't know how to process something like this. There's just no way to wrap this into a neat little bow, It's just, well, strange. So before I say anything, this is not a creepypasta or a fake story or anything like that. It's a real experience that I had, but that's up for you to decide, I suppose, if you believe me or think that I'm crazy or whatever. But this is not an attempt to make a creepypasta or just a story to amuse you. I'm no writer by any means. I'm a geography major in college. Perhaps a hallucination or creation of my mind at the time, but whatever it was, it felt very real to me. I've never had any mental illness other than depression or anxiety that I now medicated, but never anything more serious than that. At the time that this happened, I hadn't done any drugs other than a few beers after the incident to relax and get to sleep. So this was in 2017. I was turning 18 at the time. I'm 23, nearly 24 now. I haven't told anyone in my personal life because of two reasons. One, they'd think that I'm either crazy or more likely making it up, and I have a reputation for not being a liar, making things up. I hate being called a liar, and I've went out of my way in my life to be as honest as I can. If not, sometimes too honest, I suppose, but because I just hate being called a liar, even if I'm actually lying in this case by neglecting to tell it. Or when someone asks me if I've ever had any supernatural experiences, I just say no, but honestly I have. I just don't want people to think that I'm crazy or lying, but it's been years since this happened, and I just have to tell someone. So here I am. Also, for what it's worth, I'm not religious by any means. I'd say that I'm agnostic, if anything. I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I also don't say that it's impossible, as I don't know everything, far from it in fact. But this story doesn't help. I don't believe in ghost stories for the most part, UFOs, etc. I'm very skeptical of that stuff and believe that there are explanations that are far less exciting than people would like to believe. But this is something that I've experienced that I cannot explain, and it still bothers me to this day when I think of it. I often have nightmares about it too. So, some backstory first. My mother and little sister were going to visit my grandparents. They lived near this little town called Eminence, Missouri, about 30 minutes south, I think south of the town, deep in the mountains. In any case, it wasn't super remote. There were neighbors a few miles away and such. They were hillbilly types, as you could imagine. It's deep in the Ozarks in Missouri, so yeah, lots of missing teeth and meth and crazy old mountain folk. If you've been in the Missouri hills, then you know what I mean. We were staying in a camper about 200 or so foot from the grandparents' house, my mom's sister and I. One day, a few hours before dark, I decided to get onto the four-wheeler and go into the woods. I had toyed around in the woods and hills a bit, but I wanted to go deep in there on a four-wheeler and have some fun. So I filled the four-wheeler up, asked my grandparents where the trail was. There was a trail that you could take to ride horses down, four-wheelers, and stuff like that. It was a one-way road with no turnoffs to get lost, so that's where they told me to go, and I drove off. I rode for about 40 minutes in one direction until I was nearly half out of gas. And about this time, I was searing for a place to turn around and head back. It was a smaller, narrow trail though, so I had to wait until there was a small clearing to do a U-turn. But here is where things get weird. Now I remember as I was riding, the trees blowing the wind, the birds singing, the animal noises, the woodpeckers, all the wonderful noises of nature that I love so much from the woods, when suddenly they all just stopped. I mean, it just went completely dead silent, just on a dime. I mean dead silent, not a single sound. At this, I remembered goosebumps going all over my body just from the lack of noise alone, knowing that there were animals around, but everything just going quiet like that. It felt like I was in a noise vacuum or something, but everything felt different, sounded different, or more accurately, sounded like nothing at all. The only noise was the burring from the four-wheeler, and that was pretty much it. As I was riding down the mountain, I saw a huge deer, or antlered deer-like animal, and I mean it was massive, standing in the pathway that I was driving on, about, I don't know, maybe 50 foot in front of me or something. Not exactly sure, but close, but not too close. It wasn't there, and then 1 second, it wasn't moving, it was just staring at me, and like I said at first, it seemed like maybe a buck or a deer or something, but then I looked closer, and it had really dark black eyes, like I was staring into nothingness, intense darkness that stood out from the color of the forest really clearly. Like I said too, I still have nightmares every now and then about this thing just staring at me. The antlers were nearly the size of its body itself, but the antlers looked weird, like tree roots or something. I'm not too familiar with deer if I'm being completely honest. I've never really hunted or anything, but just the antlers were, I don't know, they didn't look like anything I've ever seen on a deer or any animal that has antlers. They were too large and too spindly or windy sort of. Something about it just looked terribly off, and I could feel my heart jump into my throat all of a sudden. I stopped the four-wheeler instantly and just stared at it. I was terrified, but also couldn't help but stare back at it. While it stared at me, I remember the wind started blowing, and the rustling of the trees occurred. It sounded like the trees were almost speaking to me in a language too, or maybe I was just hearing things and scared out of my mind. I don't know, but I remember getting the feeling that I was being told to leave and never return. That's how I felt anyway, but again, I'd never heard those words spoken, so if there was a language, it was something that I'd never heard before. It was more a feeling, I guess, that I can't explain it very well, but I may not have understood the language, but it was very clear that I needed to leave. Like, if you were in a country where you didn't speak their language, and you came up to their house door and started hearing them yell at you to leave, you may not understand the language, but you know what they're telling you, right? That's how this felt, but in a language of wind or trees or nature. I know how insane that sounds, but that's just how it felt at the time. So I did. I left. I hightailed it and bolted out of there. I turned the four-wheeler around, nearly toppling it off the trail, then falling down some 15-foot drop near the trail. Since I hadn't found a good U-turn clearing yet, and wasn't about to keep driving towards the deer or whatever this thing was. It was a tight turn, but I made it, and I floored it as fast as the four-wheeler could go. It was still absolutely silent during this time, and I've never heard silence quite like that. My father is a sound engineer. He has a home studio, and a studio that has like dead boxes or whatever that you can sing in that have no noise from the soundproofing. That's the closest thing that I can explain the silence to being. It was that quiet. In the woods, mind you, where it was alive with noise only moments ago. In any case, I floored the four-wheeler to go as fast as I could back up the mountain, around the bends, and get out of there as fast as I could, not worrying about the danger that I was putting myself in driving so fast near some of the sketchy parts of the trail that I was on. Eventually, I got on a flat, straight path, and around this time I was about maybe halfway back to the entrance of the trail, I would estimate, and I started to see animals, deer, birds. I saw a black bear too, but the only one that I'd ever seen in my life, all sitting or sort of standing near the trail, not like right next to it, but maybe about 15 to 20 feet back in the woods amongst the trees, just staring at me. All these wild animals, including the birds in the trees, all silent, not moving, and just staring at me, only their heads moving, following me with their eyes while I left as fast as I could. These animals too, not making a sound. I still couldn't hear the wind either. The birds that were up in the trees were just looking at me, all watching me silently. I'll never forget the feeling of their eyes burning into my back once I passed them all. It was a terrifying feeling, the eeriest feeling of my life, in fact, I think. I kept going though as fast as I could. The sun was getting close to setting now, but it was still plenty light out, thankfully. It was about an hour from setting, I'd say, but I just kept going. I remember going past areas that I didn't really recognize at all. I could have sworn too that I was on a new trail or had taken a wrong turn or something. But I knew that was impossible because this trail had no turn off. It was just a single road trail, a one-way or whatever, but the surroundings were 100% not the same as on my way back in. And because of this I started to freak out. I tried reminding myself though that it wasn't possible since it was a one-way trail, and so I just kept going. I remember passing a huge tree that had moss all over it, this massive tree like something out of a fantasy movie. A tree that I would have 100% noticed on the way in when I was originally coming onto the trail, and now here it was, terrain and trees with moss that I had never seen or noticed before. I also didn't see any four-wheeler tracks that really should have been there, but for some reason were blown over and no longer there. I can remember the fear that I was on the wrong trail, but I knew being a one-way that should have been impossible, so I just kept going. I mean, I wasn't about to turn around to see if I missed a turn-off somehow, or anything. Eventually, though, I came to an area that suddenly looked normal, and I could see my tracks again from where I came in. which means that somehow there was a part of the trail that I had passed through that had changed scenery and removed my four-wheeler tracks. I have no idea how this is, or was even possible. To be honest, I really don't like to think about it much. Also, I kept seeing animals on occasion, just sitting back from the trail staring at me from time to time. Shortly after getting back on the normal trail, or whatever, I remember hearing the wind pick up and start to speak to me in that foreign language that I mentioned earlier. I've never heard wind like this before or since, and I've been in the woods when it's windy a fair amount of the time. It was otherworldly though. I don't know, thinking about it now still terrifies me. But this time it sounded less ominous, I guess, and more friendly. I know that's weird to say, but as if it was encouraging me to keep going, and I was doing the right thing by leaving, as if it was no longer angry at me for my intrusion. I eventually got to the entrance of the trail, which was a two-way. It was a sort of Y-shaped trail. The right side was the side that I took. The left side was another trail that was also a one-way, but in a different direction, and the tail of the Y was the way back home onto the highway. I remember as I pulled off onto the shoulder of the highway from the trail, everything went silent once again. That dead silence that I was talking about was suddenly back. I turned back and I saw that same deer or whatever it was standing there, but this time it was moving, stomping its foot and raising or lowering its head like a horse shaking or flies. The wind blew once again and I felt like it said again. It never made any understandable words or anything, but never return or something like that. Then it walked into the trees and out of sight. Once out of sight, maybe a few seconds later, I began to hear the birds sing. The normal noises of the forest returned, and everything returned to the expected normal of the woods. I just sat there staring back from where I had come into the woods, feeling absolutely relieved to be out of there, but also feeling like I had no idea what had just happened, or how even to pass it out in my own mind. I was shaking and barely able to keep my thumb on the gas trigger on the four-wheeler as I peeled out onto the shoulder of the highway to finally get back home. I just got back into the highway and started to gun it about a mile or two up the road to my grandparents' driveway. On the way there I passed a local on his gator, a type of four-wheeler with a trunk thing on the back, more for farm work than fun, and he waved at me, and maybe it was just me already being creeped out, but he had this sort of look like he knew what I had just seen, like he was sort of in on it, I guess, but I just kept going. It was probably just my imagination making a friendly stranger more than what he was, and I just waved back and I motored on. Now all I know is that I will never be going back into the Ozarks, or any mountains for that matter, for pretty much as long as I live, I think. I know that people may think that I'm lying or trying to make up a story. I went crazy temporarily or whatever, but I know what I saw. I have no idea what it meant or what it was about, but whatever it was, it didn't want me there, or wasn't where I should have been, or whatever, so I will never return to those mountains ever again. Again, I don't know what I saw. I don't know what happened. I'm open to the idea that I had a hallucination, as that makes far more sense than what I saw being real, but I just don't feel that that is what happened. Then again, how would I really know, I guess? It drives me insane trying to figure this out, and I guess I'll never really know. Maybe I just need to chalk this up to another weird story of being out in the woods that people hear, but I'll tell you one thing. I definitely take weird stories people say that they've heard or seen in the woods a little bit more seriously these days. All I can say is that while it all sounds insane, looking back on it, I never felt in danger, I guess. I never felt as if this animal wanted to hurt me, simply scare me off, as if I was somewhere I shouldn't have been, and they were doing me a favor by leading me back home to civilization. I am curious, though, if anybody listening to this has had any similar experiences in the Ozarks or mountains in general. I just had to get this out somewhere, at least where nobody knows who I am, so that if I am called a liar or a schizophrenic or a creepypasta maker, at least it's anonymous, right? But in any case, there's my story, or whatever you may think of it. I live a normal life these days. I'm in college doing well, and have an apartment with a buddy, and I have a girlfriend, a job. I'm very happy enjoying life, and most of the time I'm just an average guy like everybody else. But sometimes this whole thing pops up in my mind, and I remember, or I have a dream, and it all comes back. An experience that I'll never forget, but quite honestly wish that I could. Anyway, if anyone has been in this area, and had anything similar happen, then I would love to hear it. It would make me feel better to know that I'm not the only one. I've Googled some, and haven't found anything similar to this experience that I considered credible, I guess. But like I said, if you have a story, then I would love to hear it. We were at a Sportsman Warehouse in Colorado with our parents. I was 14, and my little brother was 12. We were on a trip to see family, so we were about done walking around, and decided to sit down in the camping chair aisle while we were waiting for our parents to be done shopping. While we were sitting there, a lady that looked cracked up on some sort of drug walked up to us and started asking us some weird questions. She asked us where the Colorado River was. "Can you show me on the map in the front where the Colorado River is?" There was a map of the US in the front of the store right by the entrance. She kept telling us to walk up there with her because she needed help finding the Colorado River on it. We both were weirded out by this and started to walk and find our parents. She kept following us and didn't stop. We found our parents and I told them what happened. My mom started yelling at this lady, but she wasn't going away even after that. We checked out and started leaving the store, and when we walked out we saw the creepy lady and 3 or 4 men run out of the store near a van that was hidden out of any camera's view. 2 of the men were waiting outside of the store, and that's when I realized what was happening. The lady wanted my little brother to go to the front of the store so that the 2 men could abduct him and run to the van. I am so glad that we followed our instincts that day, and we didn't follow the lady. To this day I'm very cautious when I go into town, especially because I live on the border of Mexico and Arizona. I guess the moral of the story here too is that you need to be careful when you talk to strangers. Even if you are an adult, you just never know how many people may be in on an abduction. This happened not too long after I moved to England. Back then and still to this day, my country's living conditions weren't great, with everything getting worse every year. Low salaries and high cost of living, so I decided that I'd had enough. Not too long before that, my best friend had moved to England with her boyfriend and her dog. They lived in a house with a spare room, so we planned it out, and I moved to their house and shared the rent while I tried to find a job in my own place. We didn't last too long in that house though, and 2 weeks after I moved in we moved into a different house, but the house itself was supposed to be better, but the neighborhood that it was in, well, let's just say that it had a lot to improve on. The problem though was that my friends had the dog, and most nights they would get into huge fights about who was the most tired from work, who worked the hardest, who did the most at home, and other nonsense that I didn't have the patience for, so I would end up offering to take the dog for his walk just so that I didn't have to listen to them anymore. It would usually go pretty well, I think, especially because this was around the pandemic time, so there were a lot less people on the street. One night though was different. When I offered to take the dog and walked out of the house with him, I had this strange feeling going on like that night I shouldn't have offered to go and should have just stayed at home. Then again, maybe it's best that it was me and not my friend. Back then I was 25 going on 26, well built and broad-shouldered, and could easily take a fight even though I'm not a very tall guy, so would probably present a bigger threat than my friend. In any case, I went down the stairs, walked out of the building with a trash bag in hand, dumped the bag, and went on my way to the closed entrance. As always when I got to the main road, because I like to keep the walks different and fresh for the dog, I looked both ways to decide which way to go. That's when to my left I noticed this guy jogging in my direction. What troubled me though is that he was jogging in completely normal day-to-day clothes, not dressed to go out for a run at all. Thinking that I didn't want to be judging people and didn't want to be feeling uneasy, I decided to just walk the other way and try to ignore the guy running my way. If it was the case, I would cross the road and see what happened. I wasn't the only one feeling uncomfortable though, as the dog was refusing to just go about our way. He was an intense dog with a massive focus when it came to trouble, and was a mix between a bulldog and a Portuguese hunting dog breed. So he was medium-sized, muscular, and had the habit of staring people down in a way that would make everyone feel uncomfortable. That's just what he did then. I turned to my right, started walking down the street, having to pull the dog along every 5 seconds because he wouldn't stop turning around, and observing this guy who was still about 30 seconds jogging away from us. Of course I kept my eye on this guy as well, taking advantage of having to pull the dog along to keep measuring how far the guy was from us. And when he was starting to get too close for comfort, I decided to cross the street. If he was just running past, he would be on his way. If there was something else happening, he would cross the street as well, and of course that's exactly what happened. When I started crossing the street, the guy crossed it behind me, and then I decided to actually stop and let the dog stare the guy down to see what would come out of this. It was like I had messed everything up for him too. He looked sort of surprised, stopped running, and walked us with both me and the dog eyeing him. He then lifted his hands like he was surrendering and said, "Hey bro, all good?" To which I replied, "All good? You?" "Yeah boss, yeah," he said. Then he walked ahead of us and finished crossing the road, and I went back to the same side of the road that I was on to begin with and thought that that would be it. No trouble, just a slight misunderstanding, I guess. That's when the guy stopped, turned around, saw that I was not on his side of the road anymore, and did the weirdest thing. He took 2 steps back up the road and hid behind a tree like he was hiding from somebody else that was ahead on the street. This made me even more uncomfortable, and I was now having to control my shaking legs, adrenaline, and increasing heartbeat, and not let any signals give my discomfort away. I ignored it, kept walking ahead, walking past the guy on the opposite side of the road, looked him in the eye again to warn him, without having to say anything, and kept walking. 10 more steps was all it took. With this weird guy behind me, I heard something shuffle ahead on the street. Initially I thought this could be a fox, but stopped when I decided the shuffling sounded like it was coming from something way bigger than a fox or a dog. Another person maybe. Then I saw it. There was somebody else hiding behind one of the upcoming houses, trash cans, waiting for me to get there. I could see a part of their back showing up from one of the sides. I don't know if me and the dog could have taken them on or not, but I decided then I wouldn't risk it for me, let alone risk the dog's life. I turned around and started walking up the street again, walked past the guy, walked past the first guy who was still huddled behind the same tree, nodded at him and said goodnight and left. The surprise in his face confirmed everything to me. They were not expecting me to understand what was going on, were not expecting me to turn around and simply walk away, and the first guy was not expecting me to still interact with him at all. For the night I decided to just let the dog do his business in the little grass area behind our building, and that was it. Now considering that this was a very dangerous and high-crime neighborhood, which keeps getting worse, and a month later my boss's son and his friend were mugged at knife point with a machete just up the road from where this happened. Honestly, I think that I made the right choice that night. I was a very odd child. I always liked weird things and the unknown, so I dabbled like a moron. And as we all know, when you go looking, something comes looking for you. I was about 13 years old, living in an apartment building with my mother and stepfather. I've always had insomnia too, and one evening I was tossing and turning when suddenly I just felt what I can only describe as dread. I was absolutely terrified. I had no lights on as I was trying to fall asleep. In this bedroom I had double sliding mirrors facing my bed. I didn't know any better, but finally I summoned up the courage to open my eyes and roll over. When I did, I stopped breathing. Standing next to my bed facing the wall, and looking outside, was a girl roughly the same age with long black hair and a soft pink polka-dotted nightgown, just staring at the wall, not moving, not breathing. I stared at her for what felt like hours, but it was maybe just moments, then I hid under my covers. It was probably about 15 minutes before the dread passed, and when I finally opened my eyes and peeked again, she was gone. This was the first and last time that I ever saw her. I would always get home first as my mom and stepdad are police officers, so I was always alone. The apartment sometimes would just feel so heavy too. My computer desk faced a wall, and my back would be towards all the doors. These doors would creak and move all the time, which was whatever, but one day I was on my webcam, and I looked, and in the door to my parents' room, there was a black mass standing there just existing. I of course panicked, and looked behind me to find nothing. Things like this continued to happen to me throughout living there too. Fast forward 2 years, though I'm now living at my stepmother's home. I was taking care of her during her stage 5 breast cancer, so I'd often be home alone while she was in the hospital undergoing treatment. One day I'm sitting in the living room watching TV, and from the corner of my eye I see roughly 4 people in my yard walking up to my porch. I was weirded out as we lived in pretty much the middle of nowhere, but my stepmom has so many friends that it wouldn't have been too strange for someone to come and visit. I wait and wait for a knock, nothing, so I go and open the door, and nothing, no one is there. I go and look around the property, and the gate, nobody's there either. I just ended up ignoring this and went about my days, but maybe a month or so later I'm downstairs again with Sky, our beautiful massive GSD, just watching TV. Suddenly we hear a slam from upstairs. It sounded like somebody got up, and then fell again. I was there alone with just the dog, but the dog was with me. It took me a good 30 minutes to go upstairs and look. I was scared obviously, and Sky was scared as well. I wasn't going up there without her, and she was refusing to go up there at first. I checked my stepmom's room, and everything was normal, so I go about checking all the rooms. I finally get to my room, and when I get there it is absolutely destroyed. My clothes were everywhere, my bed was disheveled, and a dog kennel that I had in there had the door ripped off. It was sat neatly next to the kennel itself. Needless to say, Sky and we slept downstairs that night. After that incident, things seemed to die down a bit though, and I'd mainly just see shadows from my eyes darting around and shadow people walking with me. At 15 to 16 years old, I got really into the supernatural at one point, so I started opening my mind, trying to connect to things and see what this was all about and what was all out there. This was fine and dandy, nothing too odd for a good while just more of the same shadow people, door slamming, behind me my iPod randomly taking photos, random stuff like this. And well, around this time I met my first boyfriend. Somehow I was allowed to stay at this boyfriend's home with him and his parents on weekends and such. My boyfriend and his brother were huge into paranormal stuff, as well as brother dabbled in some very dark and wicked things actually. But one night my boyfriend, his brother, and I are at the house alone, just talking and hanging out, and I'm looking outside when all of a sudden a broom just gets yeeted across the porch. I stop and say, "What was that?" Of course they're giddy and excited, but I wasn't. I had an odd feeling, to be honest. Later that night we had gone over to a friend's house who lived up the street, and we drank and smoked and did all the teenager stuff. As we're walking home, I see something in the distance. It's right out in front of my boyfriend's house. And this thing from where we were standing honestly looked a bit like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. I freak out and shout, "What is that?" and point. This creature-like thing squat walked in front of my boyfriend's car and just never came out. I was petrified. I didn't want to walk past the car, but I also was afraid to let him go ahead and me become engulfed by the forest and darkness that we were walking in now. We made it past the car eventually, and nothing. At this point I'm done though. I'm scared and I just want to go to sleep. My boyfriend didn't want to sleep though, so he and his brother went outside to smoke and be boys. Maybe about 2 hours later I hear my boyfriend say my name. "Why are the lights out?" I'm lost. Then a moment later I heard him say, "Open the door, it's dark out here." I got up from bed, went to open the door and froze. I froze my hand inches from the doorknob. Something just told me, "No, don't do it, do not open that door." So I did what anyone would do, and I just hid under the blankets crying. Another hour passes, and my boyfriend finally comes in. I asked him if he asked me to open the door, and if he really got lost in his own home, and he looked at me like I honestly had 3 heads, and told me I'd been outside since I first came in. That was the most significant thing that happened in that home. The energy was always focused in the kitchen though, and I'd often hear someone say help from the pantry, but I always ignored it. More years passed, and I decided enough was enough, so I closed my mind off at this point. This worked for a while too until I moved to another state. I moved in with my sister. Everything was okay for a week or two, but one morning I was getting ready for work, and I heard a crash coming from my sister's room. I was alone again. I went into her room to see what it was, and she had a clock on the floor that she was fixing. It was leaning against the wall, no batteries, one hand missing, and the remaining hand was violently spinning. At this point I'm in my 20s, and I just left. I slammed the door, and I just go back to business. Then one day she opens up to me about some weird things that have been happening around the house, so I suggest that we set up some cameras, and man, it did not disappoint. We caught a hand appearing and disappearing on her couch, as if it was changing the TV channel. Then we caught the couch being hit, the computer flashing on, and then immediately shutting off and something falling in the laundry room. This activity eventually calmed down as I told her that we need to stop and do something about it. Another year passes, and I got my first house. Everything seemed great, no bad vibes, or anything. For the first few months of living there everything was good. Then one day I'm sitting in my living room, and I hear voices in my basement. I just said nope, and I didn't check. Instead I got a security system installed on all doors and windows with cameras watching me outside. While I was working one day I got an influx of alerts: garage door open, garage door shut, master bedroom window open, pool door open. I got home really quickly. I didn't call the police immediately. I didn't want them in my home without me there, since I have guard dogs. I cleared the house, and everything was fine as far as I could tell. Nobody was there. I'm a bit shaken, but eventually I forget about it until a few days later when the same thing happened. I did the same thing, rushed home, checked everything and cleared the house. So then I had this terrifying thought, what if I have a voyeur? So I bought cameras and installed them in every room, but I didn't see a single thing. The sensors still went off, so I called the company and they checked if something was wrong, but no, everything was working just fine. Everything calms down eventually, until one day, while I'm trimming my dog's nails, I hear thundering footsteps rushing towards me from behind. I didn't have time to react before I felt an icy chill in my neck. I looked around scared as if I was about to be murdered, but there was nothing there again. So I got up at this point, told whatever it was to get lost, and slammed my door. A few nights later I'm watching TV in the living room, and in my kitchen, I see a black mass peeking from around a good foot above my cabinets. When I fully looked there was nothing there, so we did a song and a dance of this for a good while, and it got to the point where I don't know, I just sort of got used to what I think. I didn't have bad vibes, so I just ignored it. Then I had to leave my home for about 2 weeks. When I came back all of my pictures had been knocked off the walls, even in the dining room. If I hadn't have had to unlock my doors, I honestly would have thought that it was broken into. So I just simply apologized to whatever is there that I'm sorry I left, but I had to. I'm home now. Everything was good for a while, until one night I was woken up. I'm in pure terror. Something is definitely in my room, and I can feel it. It's a horrific energy. I didn't dare look. I kept my eyes closed the entire time. That was maybe a month or so ago now, and I haven't experienced anything since. Obviously I have many more stories, but these are the ones that pop out to me the most. If anyone has any thoughts on what this could be, or if it's something that's attached to me, and what I should do about it, please do let me know. I was 17 when this happened. I had an early morning shift in a restaurant, and I used a bus to get there every day. When I got to my bus stop, someone was already there, and that was strange because it was so early in the morning. Anyway, I started to walk to my workplace just to notice that the man had started to follow me. Seeing the man following me had me a little bit scared, and I started to run at one point. There was so much off with this guy. Like the whole time he looked at the ground, but also started to run when he saw me running. I quickly ran to the back doors, saw him coming in the same direction. When I closed the doors, he was maybe just a couple of meters away from me, and I saw too that he tried to open that locked door after me. When I was panicking inside of the restaurant, my coworkers came to me and said that someone is trying all the windows to get in. We called the cops, and later they told us that they found the guy, and he was carrying a tiny saw with him. Sometimes I think about what he would have done if he would have been just a little bit quicker than me. I, a 20-year-old female, recently moved into a new apartment with my boyfriend, who works away for long periods of time. An older man, 50, started to become friendly with me knowing that I was new to the complex. I made the mistake of telling him that I live with my partner, but he's away for work for a while. Almost every day after that he came knocking on my door and waited to see if I didn't answer. He would leave after 5 minutes of knocking with no answer. One time I was out in the common grass area playing with my brother, he's 2, that I would occasionally have over. I saw him coming my way and quickly picked up my brother. The man started making conversation asking about my brother and literally tried to grab him out of my arms. I held on to my brother tightly and pulled away, and as he started to cry I made an excuse that I have to go and feed him and walked away. That was the last time that I went near that man with my brother. I'm extremely bad with confrontation, as you can probably tell, but still something just didn't feel right. A few days later I heard a knock at my door and opened it without thinking, and he walked straight past me into my apartment without even saying a single word, just smiling. I asked him if he was doing okay, and he said, "Oh, I'm good, I just wanted to see what your place looked like from the inside," and started walking into every room. He checked all my windows and commented, "So all your windows have bars on them, except the bathroom." I nervously laughed and said, "Yeah, I guess they do." I really didn't know what to do at this point, so I walked out into the front garden hoping that he would follow me out of the apartment to try and talk to me. I just wanted him out, but was too scared to anger him. I could tell that he didn't seem like he was right in his head, or whatever, but once he came out of the front, I closed my door, and said I have to go to the shop now, sorry, it's going to be closed soon, and walked off. Now that night, while hanging my washing out, another neighbor introduced herself, 34 female. I told her what happened, and asked if she knew the man. Apparently, he had been doing the exact same things to her as well. She told her partner that this creepy neighbor was doing the same things to a young girl, me, and that this was the last straw, and he ended up going and talking to the older man. After that, the older man only tried one more time that I know of to knock on my door, which I hid in my kitchen for 10 minutes until he left. I haven't heard anything since then, and haven't seen him around, but I wake up at night panicking, sometimes thinking that he's planning on doing something to me. My window is a glass, so there's no way that I can even put a lock on it. I talked to management, and there's nothing that they can do since he stopped now apparently. I'm thinking of possibly filing a report with the police, so it's at least on record, but again there's really not much that anyone can do, I guess. Here's hoping that this doesn't escalate any further. Every person that has ever been close to me has seen, or had a conversation with me, when I wasn't around at least once. This started happening around the time that I turned 13. I had an early day at school, and decided to hang out at a friend's house instead of catching the bus home. Stayed for a few hours, and I walked home. When I got into the house, though, I heard my mom speaking to someone upstairs, which was unusual, since we weren't normally the only 2 people that were there at any given time. When I turned the corner to see what was going on, I saw her looking into the open door of my room, and heard her having a conversation. Obviously confused, I asked who was over, at which point she nearly jumped out of her skin, turned around, and got white as a ghost. At the time she told me that she was on the phone, but later confessed that she thought that I'd been home since school got out and was trying to wake me up from a nap. A few years later, I got into my first serious relationship. After a few months of dating each other, I had moved into my first apartment with a few close friends, and one night, while she was staying over, I was awoken and saw that she was crying. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me that she had gotten up to use the bathroom. When she came out, she saw me walking down the hallway and towards the stairs. Assuming that I'd just woken up from her getting out of bed and went to get a glass of water or something, she didn't think anything of it until she turned the corner and saw me laying in the same spot that I was in, completely asleep. Not long after that, my roommates also started having similar experiences, usually at night. This has since continued throughout every relationship and close friendship that I've acquired, to the point where it's become something that I have to disclose while also trying to sound sane, which is not always easy. The most troubling and confusing part about all of this, though, is that I've never personally experienced it, and the only time that I'm aware that it's happened is when I'm comforting someone from whatever it is that they actually saw. So I was 7 years old, Spencerville, Indiana. It was a middle of 4 chilly night. I'd just gotten inside from stacking hay up to about 9 p.m. I got cleaned up and changed, so I went to grab some leftovers when I heard a knock on the door of the outside covered porch and went to check who it was. When I got there were 2 children with black eyes, black as night. I originally thought that it was just too dark to see the colors at first, and they asked if they could come in for a second and use the phone. I had never seen them before, as I knew every kid in my little town. I asked them to wait while I go and get my grandpa. He went out and I heard him say something, but I couldn't hear him. When he came back and he looked white as a ghost and told me to go to bed. I started to argue with him about my food that I wanted to eat, and he just screamed at me like he had never done before. I never knew anything about black-eyed children until the last year, and I remembered this, and man, did it send chills down my body. So I don't typically believe in this kind of stuff, but I had a strange encounter a while back that I was telling my coworker about, and they insisted that what I saw was a wraith. I've been doing some research since I had no idea what it was, and I gotta say that it looks very similar to what I saw. So I was driving home from work at like 1:30 in the morning about 2 months ago, and was heading down this typically busy side street, except since it was late there wasn't a lot of traffic, just a Jeep in front of me. As I was driving around a bend in the road, I saw on my peripheral this figure to my right by the sidewalk, standing between 2 small trees, held up by wire supports. This creature was standing kind of behind them, I guess. At first I thought it was just a big slender dog like a white greyhound or Great Dane that escaped, and seemed to be standing and barking at traffic by the sidewalk. I only noticed it as I began to pass it, but as I passed it I quickly noticed that it appeared to have a humanoid-shaped head with black eyes, a hunched back posterior, and a long stretched mouth like it was screaming. I was going maybe 45 miles per hour when I passed it, and it was dark out. I thought to myself, what was that? So I slowed down quickly to look back, and in my mirror I saw the creature turn around and run towards a wooden fence. But as it ran I saw just how tall and slender the creature was. It seemed pale with a sort of anorexic appearance. It moved strangely, and its leg joints were inverted and bent in the opposite direction. At that point I was obviously seriously creeped out. The Jeep in front of me also slowed down, so I can only assume that they saw it too. We both kept driving as it was late, and couldn't stop in the middle of the road, but that situation really made my skin crawl. I kept checking my mirrors for the rest of the drive home, and debating if I should have called a non-emergency line to have an officer check it out, but I told myself that they would think that I'm just an idiot, and that they wouldn't believe me. These days every night when I take that road I look around to see if I can spot it again. I really want to believe that it was just a dog, but I can't stop thinking about how strangely it moved with its backwards knees. I haven't talked about this much except to my coworker, because quite frankly I know it sounds ridiculous. I'm just wondering though what the heck I actually saw, and if it's something that I should even be talking about, or if I should continue to pretend like I never saw anything, and just move on with my life. It was a normal day, and I was playing with my dog outside named Harley. She was an English bulldog that was as friendly could be. My aunt called me in for bed. I was sad because I was having fun with my dog playing tug of war, but I went inside and laid down on my bed. My uncle came to my room. He gave me a hug, and he tucked me in. At least an hour later, I put the Goofy movie into my VHS player, and all of a sudden I had a really weird feeling. Not like I was being watched, or like I was dreaming. It was a feeling of familiarity, like I was in the presence of somebody that I knew. I didn't feel scared. I looked up, and there he was, at least 6'4" to 6'6", wearing a long trench coat that went all the way to the ground, and a broad-brimmed hat. Whatever I was seeing was completely black, darker than the dark room that I was in, and completely featureless. When I saw it, I wasn't scared or paralyzed. I guess I was more curious, and I honestly felt safe and like it was friendly, so I said hello and snapped my fingers just to make sure that I was awake. I looked at him for at least 10 minutes before I waved at him. As soon as I wave at him, he's gone as fast as he had appeared. I lay in bed completely stunned by what the heck just happened. I went back to watching the goofy movie, and I had an entirely normal night after that. Nothing else was strange or out of the ordinary. The weirdest thing was that I wasn't scared by this shadow figure. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calmness and curiosity, as if I'd encountered a long-lost friend. It was as if the presence of the shadow figure had somehow reassured me rather than instilling fear. I really have no idea what this thing was. It was very similar to the description of the Hat Man, but I could tell that I wasn't being threatened by this presence. The shadow figure seemed to be observing me from a distance, almost as if it was studying my every move. The encounter with the shadow figure left me with a lingering sense of curiosity, and it's as if that brief interaction held a hidden meaning or purpose that I may never fully comprehend. Despite not seeing him again, the memory of that enigmatic presence continues to puzzle and fascinate me. In my job, I visit care homes for reviews with residents. I spend most of my day in and out of the places for at least a couple of hours at a time, to spending at least a day there at times as well. I've gotten pretty used to the routine now, but I have had one strange thing once before where my case died. I was in the care home the next week visiting another case. The staff said that the first man's buzzer hadn't stopped going off at night since he died. It had never malfunctioned until then. He was still empty. There's also a basement room in another home where I have to go to look at files and whatnot, and something happens in that room the moment that you enter. You become sleepy and lethargic, and when you leave you wake back up again and go back to normal. Everything just feels very heavy, and it's not just me. I asked around the office, and other people have felt it too. Today at work, I was in a larger than usual home. I'm sat in the nurse station looking through files, and two people walk in. It was a woman and a man. I don't look up from my files, but I see them in my side vision, sort of. The woman is a staff nurse. She enters first, and the man follows her closely. She crosses the room behind me, reaches for the paperwork on one side of me. She then goes to the other side of me and sits down. As she sits down, I become very conscious that the man is on my first side where she's first retrieved her paperwork. He's still in my side vision. Big burly guy with brown hair and hands on his hips wearing blue scrubs. He's facing at me and the nurse, and I can feel him staring down at me. I sort of instinctively feel like I'm squashed between two people. It's a small office, so you know when you don't get much personal space how you sort of get a mixed feeling. It was a bit like that. I look up to ask if he needs anything, and when I do, he's just gone. No one has left the room, mind you. There was no way that it was a person that walked away. He just disappeared in not even the blink of an eye as soon as I moved my head. Also, the blue scrubs, they aren't even any of the care home uniforms, but I guess that just didn't occur to me until well much later. The house that I would consider to be my childhood home is the one where I lived from age 3 to 20. There are so many stories that I could tell from living in that house, but today I'll focus on two. One happened when I was about 7, and the other happened when I was around 13. When I was 7, I shared a room with my younger sister. We had a bunk bed, and I was on the top bunk. We slept with our door open because both of us were scared of the dark, and the lamp in the hall was always on. Now, I've always been a pretty light sleeper. If someone were walking down the hall, I would always wake up. On this particular night, I was sleeping with my back to the room. I remember being scared awake because I felt someone rub my back and pull the blanket up over my shoulders. I thought that it was odd because I hadn't woken up to my parents walking down the room. I brushed it off, kept my back to the room, and just went back to sleep. The next morning, I asked my younger sister if Mom or Dad had come into the room last night, and she said that she didn't hear anyone. So being the curious kid I am, I asked both my parents if they had come into my room at any point last night. They told me that they hadn't because they were feeling under the weather and went to bed not long after my sister and I laid down. I remember hearing them talking and their door opening and closing right after we laid down, in fact. So after my investigation, I've decided that there was a ghost in that house that was watching after my sister and I. I may have woken up afraid because I was caught off guard, but I felt an overwhelming sense of peace immediately after the fear subsided. Maybe that's why I didn't bother turning around that night. Anyway, so at 13 it was very different though. I had graduated to having my own room and was no longer in a bunk. I slept with my door closed, and also a bit heavier now. Still pretty light, but I didn't wake up every time someone opened a door in the house is what I'm getting at. It was around 2 a.m., and I woke up because I think I needed to pee really bad. I get up and walk to the door, but hesitate with opening it. It was just a sense of dread at what might be on the other side all of a sudden. Eventually my bladder won that fight as it normally does, and I open the door slowly. I peek out and don't see anything, so I run to the bathroom. After I finish, though, the same dreaded feeling happened when I went to open the bathroom door. Again I peeked out to see nothing, and in the end, I just made a run for my room. I make it to my room and immediately jump under the blankets. I settle down after being panicked for a bit and roll over onto my stomach with my head facing the wall. I'm on the verge of sleeping now when I felt something whack my lower back like I've never experienced. Of course my immediate reaction was to jump up and turn around to yell at my sister. She had gotten into the habit of pranking me by now. I turn, but I don't see anyone there. So I get out of bed and I check around to make sure that she wasn't hiding anywhere. Once I check the room and see that she's not anywhere in it, I suddenly become very scared. I run to the door and fling it open. The dread of staying in that room was just way more than that of the door from earlier. I go into my sister's room, and sure enough, she's passed out on her bed. I decide then that I'm sleeping in her room. Once I told her what happened, she rolls her eyes, but lets me in bed with her. She just doesn't believe anything that doesn't personally happen to her. I didn't experience anything else that night, thankfully, but it was scary enough to remember it even years later. Now I'm really not sure if the same well, whatever that was, is involved with both stories. I never experienced the tucking in again, but had plenty of times being scared. I wonder if we did something to make the ghost, or whatever it was, angry, and it went from being kind to being threatening. I say we because my sister and I have some shared stories. Maybe there are two different things there, and the scary one became the dominant one or something. I really can't say, and I wish I had more answers, but whatever the case, I was happy when we left that house. A few years ago I was awoken one Sunday morning by a phone call. It was a little girl, I would guess maybe around 4 years old, and she said, "Morning, Granddad." I laughed. She sounded sweet, and then gently explained to her that she dialed the wrong number, obviously. "Oh," she said before hanging up. A few minutes later the phone rings again. "Morning, Granddad." I laughed again, and apologetically told her that she dialed the wrong number again. "Are you coming, Granddad? What time are you coming? Hurry up, we're about to get started." She was absolutely bursting with joy, and whoever her granddad was obviously a very lucky guy. It sounded like there was a birthday party or something going on like that. Still laughing, I tried to explain her mistake to her, and said that obviously I'm not her granddad before saying bye and hanging up the phone. I lay in bed laughing for a bit, but a minute later the phone rings. "Morning, Granddad." The third time I explained that I'm not her granddad. "You're my granddad, silly," she said with a bit of a funny tone now. She thought that I was her granddad playing a trick on her, and she thought that it was funny. Again though I explained that I am not her granddad, at which point she drops the phone and runs off into the background. I could hear her in the background saying, "Dad, Granddad is playing tricks on me, he won't talk to me." I could hear that she was getting slightly upset at this point. Then a man picks up the phone. "Dad, is everything okay?" The man says. So I, still finding this whole thing funny, explained to the man that his daughter had simply dialed the wrong number a few times, and it's all a misunderstanding. Then he says in a concerned tone, "Okay, Dad, are you at home? Stay where you are, we're on our way over." Now he thinks that I'm his dad, so again not laughing anymore now. I explained that I'm not who he thinks I am, obviously, and that it's just the wrong number. But what he said though really began to scare me a bit. He said my name, "I'm really worried now, we'll be over in 15 minutes, don't move." At that point I just hung the phone up and lay in bed wondering what the heck just happened. They never called back, and I assumed that I'd just been pranked by a friend or something. But over the next few days I asked everybody that I knew to own up to the prank, and everybody swore blind that it wasn't them. Not only was this girl convinced that I was her granddad, but the man also thought that I was his dad, and also said my actual first name. Now obviously coincidences happen, but this was just weird. So a few days later, still puzzled, I thought that I'd just ring the number back and see who answered, but the number wasn't in use. I just got a dead tone. That definitely was creepy. Who knows, maybe I was called by a grandkid in a parallel universe or something, and judging by the sound of her voice, the parallel me was one lucky guy, I guess. This story is actually my sister's. Back in 2009, my then 21-year-old sister was living alone after getting into a fight with my parents. She worked as a waitress while going to school, so obviously money was scarce. She was living in a very bad part of town in an apartment complex that from far away looked okay, but things got weird once you took a step closer. It was one of those two-floor South Florida buildings, but all but maybe 5 units were currently occupied. A 5 out of 18. The rest were in such bad shape that they couldn't be rented. We're talking about holes on the roof, broken pipes, etc. One night though, my sister is getting home at around 11 p.m. after her shift was done, and she notices this old van parked in one of the spots next to the stairs that she had to take to go up to her apartment. I guess natural instincts kicked in, because she decided to not use these stairs, and use the other set of stairs on the other end of the building. She had to walk across the entire parking lot to reach these stairs. As she's doing this and going up the stairs, she looks at the van, and she realizes that there's 2 people in it sitting in the dark looking at her. Seeing this, she decides to hurry up and sort of sprint to her apartment. By now she sees that these 2 men get out of the van, and they start running up the stairs next to their van to try and catch her. Her apartment is so close to these stairs that by the time that she's near her door, they're halfway through the stairs. She turns around and starts running towards the other set of stairs that she had just come up from. By the time that she's going down the stairs, the guys are chasing after her, running into the 2nd floor towards her direction. She couldn't run across the parking lot back onto the street, because they would have caught her for sure eventually. So instead she ran to the back of the building, hoping to jump the fence or something. Well, that was too bad, because the fence was too high. She obviously wasn't going to make it up, so she spots all the way back to the corner this big dumpster that has a lock in it. She runs towards it, hoping to get on it and jump the fence and get on the street, but when she jumps, the entire plastic lid collapses with her weight, and she falls inside the dumpster. She can hear these guys turning into this area now, and going, she must be in one of those apartments. Remember that they were abandoned and had no windows. So they start calling her and telling her to come out and to not be scared. She's inside the dumpster, mind you, holding the cover up with her hands from underneath, making it look as if it was closed. They get near her, she can hear their steps, and since the dumpster was locked, I guess that they didn't even try to pull up the lid, and in the end it was this innocent lock holding this thing together that probably saved my sister's life. Had they pushed the whole thing up, it would have fallen apart, and my sister would have been exposed and probably murdered. They went inside the apartments, and she could hear them. The whole thing must have lasted about 40 minutes. They eventually gave up, and they just left. My sister, she didn't sleep, didn't move, and didn't leave the dumpster until the following morning. She got out once she heard the cars and saw daylight. Thankfully the van wasn't there anymore, and she moved back home that same day. I'm looking for some opinions on this encounter, because although it was years ago, I always think about it and just wonder what if. So basically we were crossing the border of Costa Rica. The border has a long standing line where you wait to go through the border control, and there's a bunch of taxis on the other side. The line is pretty long, and my friend and I, both female and 23 years old at the time, we're at the back of the line at this point. This man eventually comes up to us and is speaking Spanish. We don't understand, but he guides us toward the front of the line and puts us next to 2 other American girls. We're confused and ask what's going on, but he says in broken English, "You 4 together, I take you in taxi." We think that it's a bit weird, but we did skip some of the lines, so we stay next to the girls. We talk to them, and we all agree that we think that it's very strange that he put the only 4 young backpacking girls together, and we clearly don't know each other, and is aggressively making sure that we get in his taxi once he crosses the border. Anyways, we cross the border, and he's waiting for us. He begins leading us to his taxi. We tell him no though, and immediately jump into another taxi with 2 male backpackers that seemed much safer. And as we look back, we see another guy yelling at the guy who was just trying to get us to come with him. They are fighting now, and he seems to maybe even hit him on the head for possibly not getting us in the car or something. I don't know. My question for all of you guys is this normal, or was he about to traffic all 4 of us somewhere? I really don't know, but something about that situation just seemed really fishy. The house was built in 1922. I'm sure exactly of all of its past history, but when I was little, I had oftentimes had these dreams where I would wander through my house in the nighttime, trying to find something or perhaps someone. The dream would always end when I find a tall, dark figure, nothing but a silhouette standing in the middle of my kitchen, exposed by the overhead light over the kitchen sink that hadn't even worked for years before. It was always in that dream though. I would wake up sometimes hearing these voices, not angry or any emotional, but usually just 2 to 3 voices talking mid-sentences of audible English words that were distinguishable, but didn't make sense of much really. Sometimes I would even wake up frozen, like I couldn't breathe or move, but simply lay there with my eyes wide open for a few seconds while still hearing the voices speak briefly. My mother has always experienced things, as well as my older sister. My mom hearing a jingle or eerie hymn coming from the back of the refrigerator, or maybe the pantry late at night sometimes. Things would turn on or off, and it was just a series of weird stuff. The year was 2001 though. I was 8 years old when one night my mother woke up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. She was frozen in her steps in the hall when greeted by a deep, hollow, and loud voice right in front of her, that of a man saying slowly and forced out, "Don't worry, everything will be all right." She turned on the lights and looked around, but didn't see anything. It was a snowy night, and she took a look outside, and there were no fresh footprints where anyone would have been around the home. She woke my dad up though to go investigate the voice, but my dad didn't believe in ghosts or anything of the sort. He came into my room and grabbed my wooden baseball bat, and it woke me up. I remember worrying for my dad and what was happening, and wanted to go downstairs. I hadn't heard the voice in the hall myself. I just sort of stayed awake and listened, but eventually I fell back to sleep. I only heard of this story later on when I was a bit older, and I finally knew that my dad came in for the bat that night for the reason that he did. My dad found nothing out of the ordinary, mind you, but my mom's father had passed away that previous year of a heart attack, and my dad's mother was suffering and dying of cancer at this time too. My mom seems to think that the message was in reference to those events. Throughout the years my mom and sister would experience, most of which was lights on and off, and sometimes an eerie jingle from the kitchen at night. But fast forward to 2018. My parents are divorced, and the house has been vacant for 2 years now, just to be heated during winter months. My wife and I decided to move into rent from my dad, since we were tired of the apartment living lifestyle, and the first night that I moved in and was unpacking, I immediately felt like a strong presence of being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling too, and as my wife was working overnight at the coffee shop and I was alone, it happened a fair bit. The next day is when it started to all happen again as well. I got up for morning shift at 4:30, and I was brushing my teeth just in the other room. My wife woke up to a voice that said Earl. She asked me if I had said it, and I in fact didn't. Like I said, I was brushing my teeth at the time. I thought to myself, though, oh no, here we go again, but I didn't tell her that. The next morning my wife was wide awake watching Netflix on her phone. For 15 comes around, I snooze the phone, not long after we hear this bizarre jingle, or hymn, at the foot of the bed for like 8 to 10 seconds. It was long enough for her to shake me and say my name, and I still heard it. It kind of reminded me of Take Me Out to the Ball Game from one of those little teddy bears or something. So terrified though, we both threw the lights on and searched the room, but there was nothing but boxes of clothes in our room, and nothing that could have possibly made that sound. We did get the house blessed the next day, and we hadn't experienced anything too far out after that. Occasionally a light would work itself, or the stove range fan would turn on by itself. It didn't work when we tried, mind you, which was really weird, but there was also another time where me and my wife were both standing right next to each other, and I was getting a phone call from her cell, but she was using her phone, and it didn't even show that she was calling me. To be honest, I was too afraid to pick it up, but sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I did pick it up. Later on we got home, and my sister moved in, and had one night experienced a disembodied voice at the end of her bed, just whistling the tune to the TV show that she had just finished watching. She had also taken videos and several orbs just floating around. I just asked her the other day if she experienced anything lately, and she says that she doesn't anymore. Her and her boyfriend are in a good and happy place in life for the moment, and she seems to think that this could be why if she isn't experiencing weird things anymore. She also told me that she thought that house was some sort of portal where many spirits would come through. I'm not sure what to think about that, but after me and my wife both hearing that hymn, it definitely must be something. Have any of these events ever happened to you, and what did you do about them? I grew up in a very small town of about 1,000 people. There really wasn't much to do, so my friends and I spent a lot of time walking in the spring and summer months. The town was small, but Route 2 runs right through it, and it's a highway that is the northernmost east-west major U.S. highway spanning 2,571 miles. It was and is a quiet town, but you definitely see some out-of-state cars passing through. And when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I was walking along Route 2 to go to my best friend's house. There was a wide spot off to the side of the road where I was, and a man on a blue motorcycle with a matching helmet pulled into it. I could only see his eyes through the helmet, but he seemed kind and had a nice, non-threatening sounding voice. He seemed young. If I had to guess, I would say that he was probably in his 20s or early 30s at the latest. I remember our conversation very well even though I haven't given it much thought over the years. I remember him being very flattered, and sort of naive I guess, but when he pulled in he asked me where the nearest bridge was, and I told him that there was one about 7 miles north in the next town over, or about 20 miles back from the direction that he came from. He thanked me and proceeded to tell me how pretty I was, and asked to take me to lunch. I thanked him for the compliment, and told him that I was going to a friend's house, but this went on for quite a long time. I would say every bit of 5 minutes I would guess, but he kept telling me how great of a time that we would have, and that he didn't know his way around, and could use my help picking a place to eat. I was trying to be nice, but kept reminding him that I was on my way to a friend's, and also saying things like he only had one helmet anyway, and he said that I could wear his for a short distance, and that he would bring me right back into town after we ate, and that it wouldn't be long at all. He only gave up when I pointed out my friend's bright blue house that was about maybe a block away, and that she and her family were expecting me any minute. This was kind of truthful, but a small lie too. She knew that I was coming that day, but I always told my friend that I would walk down after I woke up the next day, when we had plans, and I never gave her a call to tell her when that would be. I always slept in late during the summer too, so she wouldn't have expected me. My friend's mom was always smoking on the porch though, but her back was facing my direction, so she didn't see the interaction, but I could see her. She would have absolutely been there fighting off this man in a heartbeat if he had actually tried forcing me onto his bike. All I would have had to have done was yell for her, and she would have been there. I thought that I was invincible at the time, and so grown up I thought that I was tough, and that nobody would ever harm me. Like I said, I remember being very flattered, which is really stupid of me, I know, but I remember thinking how fun it sounded, and that I would get to ride on a motorcycle for the first time. I actually considered getting on the stranger's bike at one point, because I thought that I could take on anything, and that it sounded sort of exciting. The only reason that I didn't go was because I knew how angry my parents would be if they found out. I now know that my parents wouldn't have been angry at all, to be honest, but relieved if I had actually gone and made it back. It's funny how you process things at a young age, but regardless, I'm just really happy that I didn't want to make them mad. It could have actually saved my life, I know that. Looking back, there was no way that he didn't think that I was a kid. I was still in my awkward stage and looked very much like my age at that time, but what freaks me out looking back is that he asked me to go to the nearest bridge and wanted me to go with him in that direction, and that he was just so persistent. He could have been out of state in 7 minutes too, and nobody would have even realized that I was gone until much later that day. I, a 30-year-old female, live with my wife and our sweet orange tabby cat, but we own a home in an old neighborhood in a college town. The neighborhood is mostly families and older people. Right around 2 in the morning Monday morning, my wife and I are both woken up by our cat. Immediately after we hear him, we distinctly hear someone rattling our door. To make the sound, they would have had to have been holding the handle and trying to open it, but we rush to the living room, and my wife, wielding her aluminum bat, smacks our leather recliner and screams, "I have a bat." Our cat is crouched on the ground and growling, his hackles raised. I got 911 on the line, and we all got into our bedroom with a lock while we wait for the police. They came by and they didn't see anything. That night though, my wife didn't get any more sleep, and I only got a little myself after our cat curled up next to me. We both called out to our jobs at the university on Monday, and wound up getting lock bars for the front and back doors, and replaced the back door lock with one that requires a key on both sides. This thankfully went as well as it could have, but was just so out of the blue and upsetting for us. I mean, it was just something that we never expected living where we live. More than anything though, it's just a good reminder to stay vigilant and invest in that security measure when you can. We never imagined someone would try to break in during the dead of night when there are 2 cars in the driveway after all, but some people out there, they just don't care if somebody's at home or not. So I'm in my early 30s now, and much of this happened between the ages of 10 and 14. All of it started shortly after my family and I moved into a new home in town. The house that we moved into was fairly new construction at the time, and I don't believe that there was anything interesting about the land that it was built on. Within a couple of months of moving in, I had my first experience with sleep paralysis. I had gone to bed late at night, roughly 5 minutes after shutting the lights off and closing my eyes. I felt a cold presence touching my chest. I opened my eyes and saw nothing. Naturally, I was creeped out and ran into my parents' room for comfort. My mom convinced me that it was just a bad dream and that I should go back to bed, which I did, but immediately after closing my eyes again, I felt the same thing, except this time moving through the center of my chest with force. That feeling that expanded throughout my torso. Upon opening my eyes, I realized that I could not move or speak. At this point, I could feel something watching me directly to the right of my bed. I laid there for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, trying to scream before regaining the ability to move, and as soon as I could I jumped up, and I ran back into my parents' room. Needless to say, I slept next to them that night. Lucky for me, though, I've only had to experience sleep paralysis a couple of times in my life, but there were several other odd encounters to follow, though. You see, a couple of months after at night is when I had my next experience. My grandmother was watching my brother and me that evening, and she was on the first floor with my brother. I was on the second floor, and from my window looking down into my backyard, the house borders a small forest, and river, I saw a bright white figure walking from one end to the other. It looked like a fully grown man, but glowing, and I never really saw a face. I was obviously a bit freaked out by the sight of this, so I ducked to ensure that whatever it was didn't see me. I briefly peeked out of the window a couple of seconds after, and whatever it was gone. I ran downstairs, though, immediately to find both my grandmother and my brother in the same room. No one that I know of was in the backyard at the time, so it definitely wasn't somebody in the house. Those experiences, though, piqued my interest in the paranormal, and roughly a few months after that I convinced my mom to buy me a Ouija board. I then convinced our babysitter, who was a few years older than me, to use it with my brother while my parents were out of the house. We turned off all the lights and lit a couple of candles, and we tried to talk to the dead. At the time I was definitely skeptical, and I assumed that it was our babysitter who was the one manipulating the planchette, but it was moving, and it was definitely responding to our questions. We eventually decided that we were done with it and put the board away. Again, I just kind of laughed this one off, but I don't know, thinking back on it, the frequency of these encounters went way up after this experience. The fact is that after that I never really felt alone in this house, especially when I was the only one home. Fast forward to middle school, though I was usually the first one home, and would remain home alone for a couple of hours every day. I generally spent most of my time in the basement where the TV, video game console, and computer were. During this time I would regularly hear kitchen cabinets slamming shut, but they weren't open to begin with, mind you, and dining room chairs being dragged across the floor, and I always felt as if there was something watching, like I said. I did at times wonder if some of this was just in my head, only for the thoughts to be validated by both my brother and a few friends that would come over at various intervals. But there was another standalone event around the same time where my brother and I were playing games in his room. We were both sitting on his bed, and to my right was the door to the hallway, which was wide open. The lights were off in the bedroom, and there was some tertiary lighting sort of coming from the hallway. Out of my peripheral view was again a fully formed person, a white figure that appeared to be walking past the doorway out in the hallway, and as I turned my head right, my brother to my left sneezed, and blood came pouring out of his nose. Again, I saw just enough to be creeped out, but not enough to fully validate exactly what I saw, and the whole blood coming out of the nose thing was really random and weird. There were a few other events to follow, though more or less the same as some of the stuff described above, but all of this came to a head one night, and this is also where I saw some of the most vivid stuff to date. I was 13 at the time, and my best friend was sleeping over. It was Friday night, and we were the only ones in the house at that point. We were on the second floor playing video games when all of a sudden we heard the cabinet doors slamming and the chairs moving. I was honestly used to it by now, but my friend got a bit freaked out and asked what it was. I'm paraphrasing, but I said something to the effect of, "It's those ghosts again. Those ghosts," and this is when things got weird for us. Shortly after that, my TV just turned off. The room became very cold all of a sudden, and it was almost like the air became heavy. I don't know, it's hard to describe, but it took much more energy to get up and move around. We booked it from my room and went downstairs to the first floor. We calmed down afterwards and figured that we had just overreacted to what was probably just an odd coincidence. We then decided to go back upstairs to play video games. As we're walking up, it became very cold again, and we began to feel weighed down again. We ignored it this time, as again we just thought that it was all in our heads. We got to my room though, and turned the TV on along with the video games, and after about a minute or two the same thing happened with the TV turned off. Only this time I saw what looked like what I can only describe as a floating orb or two out of the corner of my eye, and at that we again ran downstairs. Like an idiot, I tried going upstairs a third time, same cold and heaviness as before. This time as I approached the door of the stairs, I looked into my parents' room from the hallway. The door was open and the lights were off, and to the right of their bed I saw an all-white figure standing with no torso or head. I again booked it downstairs, and at this point, we went into full-on paranoia mode. I tried calling my parents, but there was no answer. We were stuck at home feeling terrorized and not sure when the adults were coming back. At some point, we actually started like chanting or praying out of desperation, which I actually think made things worse because the air on the first floor became extremely heavy and we felt the cold rush down the stairs towards us. I also started to see the same small orbs fly into the room from upstairs, only this time directly in my field of view. This brought my anxiety to the next level, and I finally yelled out and apologized for saying what I had said earlier. And in a very candid way, I pleaded with whatever this thing was to leave me alone, pointing out that we both live here and that I wouldn't mess with them going forward if they just didn't mess with me. As I was apologizing, I saw 2 or 3 more of those small orb things, and one much larger, a dark one or purple or black sort of, all come into the room and just hang there for more than a few seconds. What's odd though is after my apology, the orbs just sort of dissipated and the air sort of cleared up a bit. My friend and I just sort of stood there looking at each other, absolutely dumbfounded of what we had just seen. Coincidentally though, my mom came home maybe 20 minutes after the whole thing ended, and everything just went back to normal as if nothing had happened. Weirdly enough too, I haven't seen anything since then. The noises that we regularly heard on the first floor continued, although they didn't bother me much at that point. I do think my friend may have been a bit traumatized from that experience though, because he claimed that he felt as if he was being watched for a while after that night too. In any case, I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts. Some of this stuff was downright terrifying in the moment, and I would love to understand what the heck I was dealing with. I'll do my best to explain what I saw, but it's difficult to paint an exact picture. I was driving across the country with my mom. We just entered California from Arizona a little bit before 11 p.m. It was a rural area, and there were other cars around, but definitely wouldn't call it traffic. I'm driving in a bit off-road on the right side, ground level-ish. I see something sort of glowing. It's a fluorescent neon dark blue, very bright, but it didn't light up anything around it. It wasn't just glowing though. It was sort of shaped like some kind of energy cell-looking thing out of a futuristic movie or video game. Probably 5 feet tall and 2 feet wide with ribbed sides. I then realized that this thing was moving, and moving very weirdly. It was sort of moving like it was glued to the ground and tracing the slightly hilly terrain, like it was on top of some kind of off-road vehicle that was sort of magnetically held down to the terrain that it was driving on. After a few seconds, it got up and disappears into the ground, and we see these 2 small spotlights pointing in the air appear where it disappeared. They were moving very quickly though, like those ones you see when there's some kind of arena event in your city, but the light didn't reach super far. These spotlights were encased by some kind of light dome and couldn't shine past it. The light was just stopped in its tracks instead of fading out into the sky, and in the dome it was lit up. It looked like fog inside of it, but not exactly fog, but I could still see those 2 spotlights shining around in it sporadically, because they were shining brighter than the rest of the dome. Keep in mind I could not see anything else as it was really dark, but I couldn't see the ground or surroundings too. I drove past it speaking with my mom, just trying to figure out what the heck that was that we just saw. All of it looked extremely unnatural, but literally 5 seconds of driving later, my mom screams, "What the heck is that?" I never actually ended up seeing what she was talking about, but she described basically what the internet says, a black stick man on the left side of the road now. It was the opposite side of the road that we saw the neon light dome thing, and about 5 seconds of doing 65 miles per hour of distance from the dome. She said that they were about 12 feet tall, built like stick figures or on stilts, and she couldn't discern ahead. I saw another story that described how they walked in the same way my mum did, sort of lolloping, or had a kind of bounce waddle in their steps. At first there was only one walking, and then another appeared close to it, and they were going towards each other apparently. I punched the gas though, and I just got out of there because I mean, the heck with that, right? I didn't think quick enough to take a video of the light dome blue thing, but I'm sort of glad that I didn't, because for some reason I feel like that wouldn't have gotten off easy for that. I'm really not sure why I can't shake the theory that this blue light has to do with the government or something going after these things, but I don't know. I'll also mention we then saw flashing things in the sky pretty far away, moving too close to each other to be aircraft, but I've written that off as probably just border patrol drones or something, as they were just too far away to make out. As for the rest of it, I really don't know what to make of it, but as I said, it all appeared completely unnatural. So me and my boyfriend, we like going out dancing on the weekend, which always ends up with us stumbling into our favorite pizza place before joining the taxi queue. We've done this most weekends for over a year now, so we've become somewhat friendly with the guys who own the pizzeria. They know us by name and always make a big fuss over us and offer discounts every time too. But here's where it gets a little freaky. You see, last night, a Sunday night at 11 p.m., my boyfriend and I were in bed because we both had worked this morning. My phone started ringing, which was weird for that time of night, and I saw it as an unknown number, so I just ignored it. But the next thing that we know, there's someone knocking on the front door. All the lights in the house were off, so we were clearly in bed and not in. I had another call from the same number, and then the person knocking started hammering on the door and flicking the letterbox. Even though I was a bit shaken and warned not to if I had been alone in the house, I never would have answered. So he goes downstairs to answer the door, and lo and behold, it's one of the pizza guys from the pizzeria holding 2 freshly cooked pizzas that we didn't order. He said not to tell the other guys at the shop apparently, but they were a gift from him to us. His favorite customers. My boyfriend took them from him and thanked him, but we couldn't get back to sleep for hours. We just felt really odd about the whole thing. We have ordered from them once for a takeaway, I think, so that's clearly how he got our address and my phone number, but it's still very weird, right? Something really weird happened today. I got home and found that there were deep scratches on my bedroom TV, and before I left this morning it was fine, but that's not the weirdest thing. The night before, my girlfriend and I were home, and we ate pizza, and we're 100% sure that there were 3 pieces left in her box that she couldn't eat. In the morning she got up and left before me, and when I woke up I looked to see if she had finished them, and found that she still had 3 pieces. A similar food incident happened to me last week when I returned from holiday. Just before we left, I left half a sausage and a box of fries in the fridge, and when I came back they were gone. I thought that I must have thrown them away before or something, or my aunt had dropped by and picked them up. Today my aunt confirmed that she hasn't been in town for over a month now, and hasn't even been by. I also noticed a little later that the microwave settings had been changed too. I have other stories of missing items and lights being left on, and things like that, but I always explained it away as me just losing it or something, and now I just don't know what to think. I don't know what to do either. The only people who have a house key are my aunt and my uncle and my dad. My uncle has absolutely no reason to come home, especially while I'm gone. My dad is on vacation, and like I said earlier, my aunt is out of town. But just the other day something else happened, that now I'm 100% sure that someone has access to my apartment. I saw a hole in the wall that was absolutely new, and also someone had opened again a completely new box of sweets. Also, there's another missing sweets, like 1 chocolate and 2 bars of Kit Kats. In any case, I'm going to change the locks tomorrow, and will sleep with a big knife by my side tonight, too, while the front door is blocked. I lived in my childhood home, from when I was a baby until 13. My family is very religious, and as a child I was taught that when you die you either go to heaven or hell, and that's it. I was never told about anything supernatural, so in a lot of these moments I had no idea what I was experiencing. It wasn't until I was older that I guess I understood. Also, because I was so young for some of these, well, I didn't understand in the moment, I only remember some details, but the last story is probably the scariest, and I honestly tear up sometimes when I talk about it. So I want to do this chronologically, but I honestly can't remember which of these happened first. So I'll kind of combine them, because they involve the same, well, entity, if that's what you want to call it. In elementary school I walked home from school every day, since it was only about a 15-minute walk. The house next door to us was abandoned for quite a few years after the last neighbors moved out, and I walked past it every day. Pretty frequently I would see this girl in the top floor window, and she looked to be around the same age as me, maybe a little bit older. Curly, dirty blonde hair, pink bow in her hair, wearing a pink and white frilly dress. I never really thought much about her, and just went home, but there was one time though that made me really confused. I was with my sister in her room playing with Barbies. She had a shuttered window in her room that faced the backyard. We were playing, and I'm really not sure why, but I just had the strangest feeling that I needed to open the window, so I did. And the girl was in our backyard standing in front of the slide. I wasn't scared, and was just sort of staring at her. She continued to stand there, and I'm not sure how long we were looking at each other, but she eventually began to just fade away. The best way that I can describe it is like when you stare at a light bulb, and you look away for a moment, and you can still sort of see the outline. It was kind of like that until she was just gone. It sounds stupid now, I know, because if I saw that now I would freak out obviously, but after she was gone I just kept playing with my sister like nothing had happened. I would see this girl pretty often too, but she never scared me. This one is short, but it was the middle of the night, and I was asleep. I was maybe 5 or 6 I guess when I was suddenly woken up to a hard punch to the stomach. After recovering and calming down a bit, I went to my parents' room, and they told me that it was nerves, so I just believed them. But I absolutely hated my parents' room. The feeling and the energy in there was so heavy and dark. The feeling of panic would wash over me every time that I was in there. On multiple occasions, I would see things in there when walking to and from my room as well. The scariest entity I ever saw, though, was standing to the right of their bed. It had skin that just looked like tar or something, and it was taller than the ceiling, so it had to bend to fit into the room. I don't remember that it had a face or anything. I eventually stopped looking in their room entirely because of this. I hated when my parents would ask me to grab something for them in that room too, and I would sprint out every time. One time though, I had walked home from school, and it was really hot that day, so when I got home I threw my hair up into a ponytail to cool off a bit. I walked into my room, and I immediately felt fingers grip my ponytail and start pulling me back to my parents' room. Context 2. All of our bedrooms were in the same hallway, and one was directly across from my parents' room. My dad and I roughhoused a lot, and my parents knew that I was terrified of their room, so I honestly thought that it was him. It didn't hurt, and like I said, I just thought it was my dad messing around with me. He's a big guy, so I went to elbow him in the stomach, but I hit nothing. Confused, I quickly whipped around, and saw no feet behind me. Just as the panic started to set in too, whatever it was, it dropped me right in front of my parents' door, and I whipped my head around to see what it was, but there was nothing. I sat in shock for a few moments before the tears started to fall. I eventually got up and found my dad talking to my grandma in the living room, and I just didn't know what to say or do. The next one though happened about a week before we moved out. It was only me and my grandma home. My mom took my sister to practice, and my dad was out grabbing dinner. I was in the living room doing my homework, I think on the couch. My grandma was watching TV in her room, which was to the left of me. The kitchen dining room and the hallway with all of our bedrooms was to the right of me. The hallway is out of sight from the living room, since it goes behind the dining room. I was focused on my homework when I started to hear footsteps. They were going up and down the hallway, and into the bedrooms it seemed. I thought that it was my sister wearing her Disney princess costume heels at first. The footsteps kept going for a while, and then I realized that my sister wasn't actually home. It was just me and my grandma, and she was on the opposite side of the house. My cat was also by my feet, and my heart sank when I realized what it was, but I just decided to ignore it and not give it any attention. It eventually stopped, so I felt more relaxed, but after a few minutes of quiet, I heard the loudest slam that I had ever heard coming from a few feet away in the dining room. It sounded like someone picked up a boulder and just slammed it on the hardwood. I was looking on the ground for what might have fallen when I heard it speak. It sounded like multiple voices hissing and groaning my name all at once. It was honestly the most terrifying thing that I have ever experienced, and I currently have full body chills just remembering what it sounded like. I just sat there frozen in silence with tears rolling down my face. I was too terrified to move or make a sound, and I finally managed to squeak out a little grandma, and nothing happened, so I started to sob calling for her. She eventually arrived, but after that it just went away or whatever. We actually moved out later that week, and the first night at the new house I had a dream. I was standing in the street outside the old house at night. It was quiet and all the lights were off when all of a sudden all of the windows opened, and it was so bright inside. It looked like a lighthouse, in fact. It sounded like a party was happening. Multiple conversations going on, and you can see shapes of people moving around the house, sort of manipulating the light, and just as quickly as it started it stopped. The windows, they all slammed shut. Everything was quiet and dark again, and then I woke up. Now I haven't experienced anything close to this since moving, but a few years ago the current owners of the house invited my family over for a Super Bowl party. We continued to know them. We knew the people living there. I decided not to go, but my sister did. She talked to the owners and asked them if they had had any experiences or anything weird since moving in. They were shocked that she asked, and apparently they were seeing shadow people in and around the house looking in the windows, which obviously was not very reassuring for me. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed hearing about all this. Sorry it's a bit all over the place. It's hard to summarize 13 years of stuff like this, but these are some of the more scary things that I can recall. If anything doesn't make sense, and you want more clarification, or have any questions, then do let me know, and I'll do my best to answer in the comments below. This past weekend my parents had an experience. I didn't make much of it, and neither did the rest of the family, but I'm going to use general terms to protect some privacy. This parent got up in the morning for work, however, they were washing some dishes from the night before. I woke up and was able to hear them washing the dishes and everything. Nobody else was in the home or awake besides one of our pets. My parent came into the room and asked for my sibling. I mentioned that they were sleeping upstairs, but we have a single room upstairs somewhat like an attic, but used as a bedroom with my other sibling. At this point my parent told me to swear that my sibling was upstairs. I explained that yes they were, and I hadn't seen them come downstairs. They then said that she had seen my sibling run around the house, and could feel the feet and items move as they ran. They were so sure that they walked over to peek around the couch to scare them play hide and seek, or whatever, and we didn't discuss it more, but more recently, I have also seen the same sibling at home despite everyone being away. This sibling is still in grade school, so they wake up and get taken to school by one of my parents. I was also getting ready to leave for work, and as I was heading out of the bathroom our cat ran and hid behind the bed. He is still a kitten, so he's very playful. The hiding is not suspicious to me as he's been running around and playing by himself throughout the morning anyway, but I was leaving the bathroom and walked heading towards the bed to play with the cat. My bedroom door is in front of the door that leads to the dining room or common area, and out of the corner of my eye I see this sibling sitting on the dining table eating breakfast with only hair covering her face. I've made out the clothes that they were wearing, and as I went to play with the cat it occurred to me to tell this sibling to stop playing with the cat and hurry up, or else they'll be late for school. And as I walked out of my bedroom, I remembered my parents had already left with them, which means that I should have been the only one in the house. I quickly went out there, but when I did there was nobody there. These experiences haven't felt malicious, I guess. The only common denominator between the two times this occurred is that the cat seems to be playing with them, which is really weird, just like he does with my sibling. That says to me that I'm not going crazy either, because when I came out that little cat it was acting as if something was there. I was reminded recently of this really scary incident involving a manager at one of the old jobs that I had. This happened about 5 years ago when I was 20. I believe he was around 42 or so, give or take a few years plus or minus. But to paint you a picture, the manager in question, who his name was Tim, was a short sort of Viking-esque guy. Red beard, red hair, bright blue eyes, stocky build, not muscular though. Tim was also a heavy smoker and a known racist as well. He dropped the N-word at least 4 times a week for shock factor during conversations. He also used to refer to indigenous people as Indians. He stopped once he found out my ethnicity and confronted him about it. He was mostly bark with little bite, I guess, but still someone I was cautious around nonetheless. He also had a girlfriend who was also 20 at the time. She was like an alternate reality version of me. Like me, she was a bigger girl, size 24-26-ish, piercings, tattoos, the works. I looked like the replicant tall version of her, I guess. It was pretty surreal, but he never outright told me that he had feelings for me, but on several occasions he'd comment on how much I reminded him of his girlfriend, and would ask if I was into women in 3 ways. I was bisexual, he didn't know that though. I gave vague answers every time that he asked me something of the sort, but one day he made an off comment about bisexual women being greedy, to which I reacted negatively, and I guessed that he must have put the pieces together from there. Anyway, a couple of weeks went by of him asking me questions about my interests, my hobbies, what I do in my off time, my favorite music, etc. Normally I'd just chalk this up to office banter, but with the creepy undertones I had a hard time engaging him about my personal life. At this time I had also started seeing my now partner of 5 years, but when my boss asked again what I was doing after work, I informed him that I was going to see my boyfriend. This sent him into a question tailspin, mind you. He asked how we met, how long we'd been dating, where he lived even. It was a bit unnerving to be honest, but once again I kept the answers vague. This time though I went on and on about how much I loved my partner, and how excited I was to have such an amazing partner in my life. I wanted to be crystal clear that I was not interested in my boss. That same evening, as we were closing, he told me about his favorite music. He specifically mentioned a band called Immortal Technique, and a song of theirs called Dance with the Devil. I shrugged as I really wasn't familiar with the song, so he put it on the store speakers while he swept, and I closed the cash register. For those of you who aren't familiar with that song, it's a very graphic and disturbing song that has a rather intense twist at the end. If you like the song, well, that's your taste, whatever, but personally as a woman, I find it difficult listening to graphic depictions of extreme violence like that against women, period. But before continuing, I'd suggest that you read some of the lyrics if you can stomach them, specifically the last half as it pertains to this story. But anyway, Tim turns up the music to an almost deafening level while I count out the cash and get our computers closed up. As he's sweeping, he's actively and loudly rapping along word for word, dropping N-bombs, of course, all the way through. He hadn't been looking at me until the latter half of the song, where the lyrics began depicting a woman being sexually assaulted and killed by a group of men. It was visceral, violent, and terrifying, but Tim turns to me at this point of the song and stares into my eyes while pointing and dancing to the lyrics while still rapping along. He was making violent gestures while doing this in my direction, a motion of a head-stomping gesture with his hands thrusting. It was horrifying, but I quickly closed the cash register quicker than I ever had in my life. I felt like I was in danger at that point, to be honest. So I grabbed my bag and jacket as the song finished. He turned it off and goes, "Isn't that something? It's poetry. The storytelling is just amazing, isn't it?" I remember my whole body was really tense, and I muttered, "Not my cup of tea," and I just left. Now I know that I should have given him my notice right then and there, but I was in a rough employment situation and couldn't up and just leave like that. After that though, he actually stopped scheduling him and I together very often, and about a month later, I gave my notice after finding a better job full-time. He was furious when I left, of course. The company actually ended up closing that location a few months later because Tim apparently lost it, according to our common connection. It was a friend of mine, a worker of his, but this friend of mine also told me that he upped and moved to the other side of the country to be with his ex-wife, which was a bit of a yikes. What made me remember this story was that a few months ago I was running errands in the outskirts of my city. I happened to stop by a random Taco Bell, and guess who walks in with a very young-looking woman on his arm? It was Tim. I was with my partner, who also recognized him when they made eye contact. My partner and I were already seated and eating by this point. Tim looked at us, though, like a deer in the headlights, and booked it out of there faster than a kite on the wind. Before he left, though, I noticed that he had shaved his head and had gotten some suspicious-looking tattoos on his arms. And when he turned around, there was also a distinct white power symbol patch on his jacket, and his girlfriend's jacket too. So not only was this guy a creep, but also a predator, and also now a white supremacist apparently. I don't go to that area anymore, unless I'm accompanied by my partner at all times. Tim is also very much a part of my past, and I have no desire to run into him ever again. My husband and I live in a beautifully restored 100-year-old craftsman home in the oldest neighborhood of Houston, Texas. We've lived here for about 3 years, and in this time have experienced odd occurrences that we're unable to explain. Until today we would joke that it must be a ghost, but never really believed it. But now I don't know, I'm not so sure. I would like to get your opinion on these things, but is there a way that we can test for energies or anything in our house or something? I feel a bit silly asking that, but I would really genuinely like to know, because I would like to get to the bottom of this. So first, about 2 months after moving into the house, I was in our upstairs guest room in our large 7-foot-tall heavy wood frame, maybe 75 pounds. A mirror which was securely leaning on the wall fell on top of me and pinned me against the bed. Thank goodness that my husband was home to help me get out from under it, because otherwise I would have been completely stuck. I wasn't hurt, but I definitely was really confused as I was just walking by, and in the past, when I've unleaned it, it took a lot of muscle to move it. On 2 occasions with different guests staying in the same guest room, as where the mirror is maybe 9-ish months apart from the previous story, they have told me while they were wide awake that they felt like someone sat on the bed, or like a cat jumped on the bed, or something, only to realize that they were alone in the room. On another occasion, while I was outside gardening this past fall, I felt someone firmly push my back, which caused me to stumble. I was certain as I was turning around that there was going to be someone there, but when I did, I was completely alone. My husband thinks that I simply lost my balance, but I very clearly felt something touch my back that I'm sure of, but there was nothing around. I couldn't have actually bumped into anything. It was clearly behind me too, but again there was just absolutely nothing there, like I was just in the middle of a field basically where there was nothing around me. And this brings us to today, which for me is the hardest one to ignore. So this morning around 7 a.m. I heard 2 thuds about 10 minutes apart. After the second thud, I got up to let my dog out, since they also woke him, and while he was outside I investigated the sound. The cat was in our bedroom asleep with my husband, and there wasn't anybody else in the house, but I briefly looked around downstairs and didn't see anything, so I assumed it must have been something outside. I got my dog and went back to sleep, and fast forward to around 7 p.m. I went upstairs to get my stepson's 10-month-old bedroom ready for his arrival. His dad was picking him up. He's with us every other weekend, and I had found that 3 of his books had fallen off of his bookshelf. I believe that these were the series of thuds that I heard this morning, but there are some things that just make it extra peculiar. Like, firstly, the books were a series of 4, and I had organized them in order when I placed them 2 weeks ago. Books 1, 2, and 4 had fallen, and the 3rd book remained perfectly intact, and erect on the bookshelf. The second thing is that they fell in at least 2 series minutes apart, not all at once. Thirdly, they fell pretty far out from the bookshelf. As a former physics major, I'm pretty certain it would have taken quite a bit of force to get them to land as far away as they did, and nothing had fallen behind where they were on the shelf that could have knocked them over like that. And lastly, for those who are curious, the bookshelf is securely attached to the wall and has many books and nail tacks and didn't appear to have been moved. The books also have an inch of clearance between them and the edge of the shelf, so I don't know, none of this makes any sense. This is strange, right? A few years ago, I had one of the most strangest experiences that I've ever had. So I exited my train onto the station platform late at night and realized that the only other person there was a tall, thin man with a hood pulled over his head who stepped out of the train car behind me. I didn't like this. I didn't like the idea that he could sneak up on me, so rather than run ahead, because I knew that with my short corgi legs anyone could easily overtake me, I looked around the platform for places where I could brace myself against something if he tried to throw me onto the platform like a trash can or a stairway. When I saw some benches ahead of me, I began to slow down, hoping that the best case scenario, that he would just walk past me, was going to be the case, so that I'd no longer have a potential serial killer attacking me from behind. Or worst case scenario, I would at least be emotionally prepared for whatever came next. He unfortunately slowed down as I slowed down though, and when I realized that he was unlikely to walk past me, I just stopped suddenly, and did the "oh no, did I lose my keys" pat down, thinking that I could force him to walk past me. He walked until he was directly next to me, turned, and just said, "Are you smart?" He didn't ask, he said. His delivery was sort of flat, I guess, no inflection. It sort of sounded a bit like a statement, not a question. His face was expressionless, and I thought of the Japanese slit-mouthed ghost who would ask you if you thought that she was pretty, and if you said yes she would kill you for lying, and if you said no she'd kill you for being so rude. The only way to wriggle out of possible death was to give a confusing answer, and while she stood there racking her brain, you could make your escape. I stared back at him and said, "Huh?" I made my eyes as wide and as vacant as possible. He scoffed and repeated, "Are you smart?" I blinked and repeated, "What?" He got a little closer and said, "You look smart, so are you smart?" I shrugged with my palms up. I literally made the confused emoji pose and squeaked a noise that sounded like the Scooby-Doo whine or growl. He abruptly turned and walked angrily away. I stood for a while watching him, and to keep that same safe walking distance behind him, I did my pocket pat down again, loudly slapping at my pant legs for a minute before I resumed walking slowly and at a safe distance too behind him. I made sure to keep him in my field of vision, while I walked the rest of the way down the platform, up the stairs, through the station, up the stairs, to the street, finally tearing my eyes away when I saw that my bus had arrived. I basically ran across the street, leapt inside, scanned my fare card, found a seat, and I sat down. I looked out the window, and to my horror, he was walking alongside the bus. He slowed down as he got closer to where I was sitting, and when he was directly by my seat, he seemed to sort of pause for a bit, but didn't look up and continued walking. I was tense the entire ride home, and even when I reached my stop, I was sure that he was going to be waiting there. To this day, I'm honestly haunted by the thought of what he would have done if I'd answered yes or no to this question. It was just such a weird experience, and I just don't know what to think about it. So before talking about this, some backstory is that growing up, my parents never entertained the idea of paranormal activity or ghosts. They would always tell me to say my prayers whenever I felt uncomfortable, and that was it. But I've always been able to feel energy around me, and I'm a very intuitive person. Growing up Christian, I was never allowed anything to come in the way of that, and I myself never thought much of ghosts, supernatural beings, or anything. Deep down though, I did know that there was truth in them, as there have been things that have happened to me as a child, even that I just cannot explain. Until recently, however, when I had a whole crisis about my religion, and I stopped going to church and stopped praying as much as I used to. Not that I don't believe in God, I just hated the brainwashing that used to happen at my church. I've started to rethink things. Anyway, at the start of the pandemic, I had a friend who was a very spiritual person, and still is, although she doesn't practice as much anymore. She would do tarot readings and give me details of my life and people around me if I asked her for it, and at the same time I began to discover spirituality for myself. In fact, I was sort of obsessed with tarot readings on YouTube, although I never practiced myself. This friend would give me more information, and I found myself becoming more interested in it. This friend would give me more information, and I would find myself becoming more interested in it to the point where I started becoming more aware of my surroundings, and wondered to myself if those things that happened to me as a kid were things that I imagined, or if they actually happened. Regardless of those things of note is the ongoing inexplicable incidents that occur in my dorm room and the constant nightmares and weird feelings that I get at night. I'm a university student, and in late 2021 I moved back into my dorm after being home during the pandemic. We had classes as usual, but whenever I came home I would always realize that my cupboard door would be open, even though I definitely would have closed it for the majority of the day. The door to my cupboard has a metal locking too, so it can't be opened unless force is applied, and my windows are always closed for privacy, so there's no wind that could have blown it open or anything. Additionally, when I would study at my desk, my cupboard doors would creak, or my bed would creak, as if someone had just sat on it. Trying to be as logical as I can, I initially passed this off as just the building being very old or something to do with the pipes, and honestly I just chalked it up to me imagining things. But these things also started happening when another one of my friends would come over. I told her about it because, well, it was freaking me out, and it would only ever happen at night too, which was weird. The way my room is oriented, though, my bed is against the wall, so when I sleep I can either face the wall or face my desk and have my back facing against the wall, and I usually tend to sleep in the latter position because I could constantly feel a sort of tickling or prickling sensation on my back, and it would always prevent me from falling asleep. I would also feel a presence if I ever slept facing the wall, or sometimes my entire scalp would sort of get the same prickling sensation. I would feel absolutely insane when this happened, and wondered if there was something wrong with me in terms of my health, but after constant searching I just couldn't find anything. As I said, this would only ever happen at night, never during the day if I took a nap, and it would never really happen if I spent the night at my parents' house. It was only ever in this room, and it freaks me out because it still happens sometimes too. I ended up telling my friends about it, and they believed me because weird stuff has happened to them too, but here's the really weird part. So recently I've been having terrible nightmares, and I've been waking up between the hours of 3 and 5 a.m., and I would wake up gasping or wake suddenly sort of. Previously there have been nights where I would wake up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, even though the room would be dead silent and dark. In one of these nightmares I dreamt of a white tiled floor and somebody that I knew getting their head bashed in, and there was just blood everywhere, and it was so red against the white tiles. Or in another dream, I felt as though I was being choked and couldn't scream, and I thought that this was all just sleep paralysis until last night, however, which is when I had the idea of sharing this story. So I had finished studying with my friends, and I was extremely exhausted as I had already had a long day. I was laying in bed replying to messages and just scrolling for about 10 minutes when suddenly I felt this presence above me, and I looked up and there was this thing leering down at me with a smile on its face. It was black and shadowy with long spindly fingers. I don't know how else to describe it, but it freaked me out. I was so tired though that I didn't know what to do when I panicked, and I hid under my blanket and I looked out a few times and it was gone, and so eventually I just fell asleep and didn't wake up until 7 a.m. A third friend who stays on my floor, who has seen and heard ghosts before, tells me the next day that she had really bad nightmares last night, and tells me each of the 3 dreams. I was shocked because she explained that she never really had nightmares in the past, but last night she felt something in her room and she was unable to sleep. This all has me really freaked out, and I'm not really sure what to do about it all and how to protect myself. If you have any suggestions, then please do let me know, because this is all very new to me, and to be honest, I'm just a bit lost. So this happened about 4 months ago. I, a 22-year-old male, was waiting for my turn at the clinic with my mother. We were supposed to be next in line to go in after the patient that was already with the doctor at the time. However, that person was there for so long, almost 2 full hours, and for some reason that's when I just had a really weird feeling that something bad might happen. While we were still waiting outside, all of a sudden a teenage girl walked in the door with her mother, who was coughing blood and looked to be in really bad shape. Couldn't walk on her own, bloodshot eyes, bruises all over her body. The girl then asked us, there were like 3 middle-aged women there. There were like 3 middle-aged women in there, and an old man in addition to me and my mom. If someone could help her mom. One of the other women that were waiting for us explained to her that it isn't a hospital, and that the clinic doesn't have the proper equipment to help her mom. Then someone else told her that there's a hospital nearby with emergency services, and gave her its name and location. We then quickly started gathering some money for her before they went. All that while the mom was still bleeding on the couch near us. Once I tried handing her the money, her mom, who didn't speak a word until then, pointed at me and screamed with all the blood coming out of her mouth. It really spooked me for some reason. It sounded like one of those animal screams that you hear when an animal gets severely hurt. Once the girl had collected enough money, I then asked her who told her to come here in the first place. She said the janitor, the short man by the building's entrance, which was super weird since the janitor that we just passed by before we used the elevator and went into the doctor's office was a strikingly tall man, and he's always the only one here. But of course I didn't think of it then. Anyways, she got the money and she was leaving with her mother. I tried helping the girl, but as soon as the mother saw me she started screaming her lungs out again. This time she was crying as well while still pointing at me. The girl asked the old man to help her get her mom downstairs instead, and at that point the patient that was with the doctor had finally got out and I immediately went in. But about 15 minutes, when I was with the doctor, we heard that agonizing scream again. I was still creeped out from what had happened before, but I brushed it off, and when I was done with the doctor I got out of the room and asked one of the women that were waiting there what that scream was and why did they come back again. She said they came back shortly after, when they couldn't find the taxi outside. Then she said the poor woman was shouting nonsense. When I said like what she said something along the lines of why is he hiding from me. Again, there were only 2 males in there. I was in the doctor's office while the old man was still outside, and then the old man went out with them and got them a taxi apparently. But when I discussed that with my mother when we got home, she suspected that it may have all been a hoax by the girl and her mother to scam people for charity. I guess I still don't know for sure if that was the case or not to this day, but that woman's look and the scream while pointing at me like that man, it still gives me the creeps. When I was 14 or 15 during the summer, we used to travel up to Pennsylvania to visit my aunt and grandma. It was usually my mom, myself, and sometimes one of my sisters that would go with us. My brother and other sister would stay with my dad at home, but we usually only stayed there for maybe a week or 2. Where my aunt lived it was country, like the closest neighbor was a good ways away, and when I was up there I would hang out with my older cousin who was 17. They lived near a huge abandoned rundown building till you could actually see it from my aunt's house, and it had a huge amount of land. My cousin says that it was a mental hospital at one point, but my aunt says that it was a hotel, but it shut down. I've tried looking it up, but I can't find any information on the building, but what I do know is that I remember this night very well. My cousin had a girlfriend. This girlfriend had a younger sister that I was interested in. My cousin was going to sneak out and visit her, and I asked if I could go with him. He said no, but reluctantly agreed after a few pleases, and to explain the path we went through the dirt road that was lit up by a few streetlights. It was an easy 30-minute walk. If we walked through the land by the building it was a 10-minute walk, and he took a flashlight with him, and we made our way towards his girlfriend's house. Mind you, it was close to like 1 in the morning at this point. The way that we needed to walk, though, we had to walk by that old building, and don't know why, but it always gave me the willies walking by it. It felt like you had eyes on you, sort of. On the path there nothing happened. We got to the house, and we ended up leaving at almost 3 in the morning, and I had a lot of fun, but when we were walking back my cousin commented how really quiet it was. This was a rural area where you can hear bugs and the nocturnal animals. He told me to walk fast, and I made fun of him for being scared. He told me to cut it out, and I remember kicking a rock on the ground. We were probably, 100 feet away from the building, when he palmed my chest in a sort of stopping motion. I look at him, and he has a sort of shushing motion and points forward. His face said it all, though. In fact, I'd never seen him like that. He was not an easy person to frighten, and I look up, and all I can see is something white spinning like as if a person was wearing a dress and was spinning like they were dancing. It was dead silent. I moved the flashlight from the ground towards the white thing, and it was a lady. Super pale black hair, but as soon as the light hits her she stops, and she kind of just evaporates. She looked like she was heading towards the front door of the building. From where we were at we could see the street lights on the dirt road, and as soon as this happened we just booked it down the road. My cousin and I didn't speak of it on the way home, but when we got to his room I asked what the heck that was, and his response shook me to the core. I don't know, man, but I saw it staring at us from one of the windows of the building when we first passed by. I just didn't want to scare you. That explained why he was so serious and didn't want to joke with me on the way back too. I have other experiences with that building, but I'll probably share those another time. Let me know what you think of this one. This happened in a friend of mine's house, Dustin. This time we were hanging out in his garage, and it was myself, Dustin, and 2 of our other closest friends, Brandon and Drew. The 4 of us were all gathered in Dustin's garage, simply hanging out and talking about all manner of high school problems. But during the talk Dustin had made his way to the opposite side of the garage next to the door there, and the 3 of us hadn't noticed that this was strategic on Dustin's part. You see, there was another light switch in the garage right next to the garage door. Dustin had hatched a scheme apparently to us by suddenly turning the lights out in the middle of our conversation. It was near midnight, and we were already pretty wound up. It was guaranteed to leave us in complete darkness, as well. However, this didn't go his way, or our way either. None of us knew what was about to happen that night, so Dustin turned out the lights like I said. It startled us at first, but we quickly realized that it was just Dustin trying to scare us. We asked multiple times for him to turn the lights back on. He responded with poorly acted confusion. He eventually turned them back on for us, and the lights in the garage were very bright. We were blinded for a second or two as our eyes sort of adjusted back to the light, but that was when we saw it. For some strange reason, when the lights came back on, the three of us on the opposite side from Dustin were all facing the same way, and we all faced the wall opposite the garage door, and it was painted white, so it made this very noticeable to us. Because we saw a black handprint that was slightly faded. Just this lone handprint right there in the middle of the wall. Now that may seem like it's pretty easily explainable, and I'll admit if that's all it was then it would be. However, what happened next, there's just no way that it can be explained. So the three of us mumbled to each other for a second, all asking if he remembered seeing that handprint before the lights went out. We all agreed that we hadn't, and that it was a bit weird. Dustin asked what was going on, and we told him that we saw a black handprint. He must have thought that we were joking, because he didn't take us seriously at all. In fact, he turned the lights out on us again, and this time we reacted with a little bit more anger, telling him to turn the lights back on. He tried to joke around with us, but we weren't in a joking mood at this point. He caught the hint eventually, and turned the lights back on. When our eyes adjusted to the light again, we saw them. Multiple black handprints this time, all overlapping each other in a horizontal straight line, and they were definitely not there before. They were leading from one wall to the next, and every wall in the garage now had a line of overlapped black handprints. They were completely surrounding us, and it sort of looked as though something, or someone had been running on all fours horizontally around us, circling us. Dustin, he definitely saw them this time as well, and the feeling of terror and panic set in for all of us. We practically trampled over one another, trying to escape the garage. Drew pushed his hands and his head into my back, ramming me through the door into the house. The three of us spilled onto Dustin's living room floor, but we couldn't catch our breath quickly enough, and kept shouting nonsense to each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We all had a hard time calming down, and we tried to convince ourselves that it didn't even happen in the end, and that we only thought that we had seen the handprints. However, when we mustered the courage to go and check again, we were greeted with the handprints still being there. The garage then became a restricted area for us when we all hung out. The only time that we would go back in was to try and do our own investigating, but we never cleaned the handprints off, mind you. They stayed there for ages. I'm not sure if it was out of fear of angering whatever had left them, or if it was just a reminder that it actually did happen. Either way, it is still one of the craziest experiences that I've ever had, and it is going to stick with me for as long as I live. So this is the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. This was in the 9th grade. There was this huge state park right outside of town that I lived in. And my friend and I would go down the trails every now and then. We'd been walking for maybe, I don't know, like 10 minutes when we realized that there was an older woman not far behind us. I only really noticed because of how out of place she looked, like she came right out of an old folks' home and was just dropped in the woods, but we were joking around about how creepy she was and sped up a bit, put some distance between us, but every time that we did, we'd look back and we would still be able to spot her. We must have done that probably 3 times, I think, but we thought it was pretty funny, but we ended up running down the trail until we got to a small bridge. We hopped off the bridge into a creek and then went around a bend. We could still see the bridge from where we were, but we were cracking up about the whole thing when we saw the old lady again. Now, we had run for a good couple of minutes, like there is absolutely no way she should have been able to catch us, especially that quickly, and it was like that she knew that we got off the trail because she was sort of just standing there on the bridge looking around. I think that that's when we both stopped thinking that it was funny. Again, there's just absolutely no way that she should have been able to get there like that. As soon as she left, we took off running the other way, and that was pretty much it. Nothing else happened, but I've always just thought the whole thing was just so creepy. I mean, there's this old lady sort of stalking us down a trail where we're isolated from anything, and then on top of that we run, and she somehow catches up to us when really she shouldn't have been able to. I still can't really explain the whole situation, but whatever happened that day, something was off. Around 10 years ago, while I was still living in a small village in the south of the UK, Loxheath to be exact, I used to travel to and from work by train. At the entrance to Swanwick Station is a long and sort of thin tree-lined road. Cars would often park all the way up this road. During one summer, every day while I was going down this road, there was this horrendous, sort of gassy smell that I could always smell at this particular spot. I presumed that it was a dead animal along the hedgerow that had died and not been found. I remarked on this smell every day, which seemed to grow worse and worse as the summer progressed too, but could never identify where it was coming from. Well, in the end it turns out that someone had murdered a woman and dumped her body in the boot of a car and abandoned it along the road. So for the entire summer, whenever I passed these vehicles, I was apparently smelling the decaying body of a homicide victim that had been missing for months. I will never forget that smell even now. So I'd gone out to lunch with my dad one day, and my gas gauge was broken. I've never been good at math, and I accidentally miscalculated how much gas I had left. And instead of stopping near where my dad works, I decided to wait until I got back to my town where it's cheaper, which as you can imagine was a huge mistake. About 10 miles later on the highway, my car comes to a halt. I pull over and I call AAA to bring me gas. And while I'm waiting for AAA, a man in a truck pulls up behind me. He asks what happened. I explain that I'm out of gas. He offers to get me some so I don't have to wait for AAA. I say thank you, that would be really good. He then tells me that I need to come with him to get the gas. I ask why, and he says that I shouldn't be on the side of the road all alone like this. He says come on, just get in, he won't bite, and he won't get the gas unless I can trust him. Well, another motorist must have saw me stranded and called the police to help me at some point, because I see a police car pulling up, and so does this man, and he literally peels out as fast as possible from the scene once he sees the police officer. Nothing happened to me, thankfully, but I can't help but look back on that event and just feel uneasy about it. I mean, I wonder what he would have done if I had gotten in his truck, or maybe if I had actually refused for a little bit longer. The whole situation, when I think about it, just gives me shivers. When I was roughly 13, a very close friend of mine invited me and my sister to come to her sister's birthday party at the campground. Megan and I were walking around the campground, just messing around with our sisters following somewhere behind us doing their own thing, but the adults knew what we were doing, and we live in a relatively small town, so they knew most people at the campground, so that wasn't weird for us to be allowed to walk around the loop like that. But we were passing a camper when we were nearing the pond that they had there when Megan said that she knew the people who were staying there and that they had a girl who was close to her age, and she had a brother. We stopped by and asked if the girl wanted to walk with us. She accepted, and we were off again. I don't remember this girl's name, but she kept mentioning her brother and how he told her that he thought that I was so cute when we stopped by the camper. We walked to the pond, probably playing it a bit, but then started walking back towards the girls' camper. When we get there, she said to me, "Wait, my brother texted me, and that he wants to talk to you." He comes out and tells me that I'm pretty, and we exchange numbers, and the next day we're texting when I ask him his age, and he was an adult. I tell him that I'm 13, and he says that it doesn't matter, I can be his girlfriend still. I remember feeling really weird after that, and I just ended up blocking him after a few days of him texting me, and me hardly replying, hoping that he would just stop. Mind you too, I definitely did not look like an adult at the time. It was obvious that I was young, and that I was a teenager. So I'm your average 29-year-old guy living in a certain Central Asian country. I won't say for privacy reasons, but I'm from Denver, Colorado, and own a house in New Jersey that I choose to live in during the warmer months. I think that I've made a pretty nice life for myself despite a turbulent upbringing, but I think most of us have been there, right? Anyway, like most of you, I discovered the internet within the past decade or so, and have been actively browsing for close to 4 years now. Around the middle of last year, I started Redditing actively. And while for the most part it's been a brilliant experience with many positive people, some users have left a terrifying impact on my life. You see, a few weeks ago I decided to take charge of my life, and using some wealth that I have amassed while working in the States, I created a donut shop. This was to honor the passing of my sister, who I was extremely close with. Her favorite food while we were growing up together was a kind of donut that my mother would make for us, and in her final days, she wouldn't get to experience this, as she passed after losing the battle to her eating disorder and poor finances. While I have been met with a lot of positive regards, some people have taken great offense to young entrepreneurship and my sister's memory. In particular, one user, who I will not mention by name in fear of retribution, has taken to relentlessly stalking, harassing, and overall inflicting psychological torture on me for the past few weeks. My life has been completely turned upside down, and it's horrible. It all started with a harmless recounting of my recent breakup, and devolved into full-blown cyber terrorism against my person. Quite honestly, I saw no harm in expressing my frustration due to a toxic ex. I suppose that my stalker saw a lot of themselves in them, or something, and didn't take too kindly to the slander as they put it. Anyway, at first, like I said, it was harmless insults against me and nothing too serious, which was fine, I mean whatever. But 4 days ago, I got a call from Wells Fargo that my accounts over in the States had been frozen after $15 was withdrawn in Connecticut. From a private investigator that I hired, I discovered that this is actually where my cyber stalker was residing. I also received in my mail flap a box of broken glass from the US. Now, the only way that this person could have found my information would have been through my private Twitter threads, which are now deleted, but they did let me know how they were stalking my Twitter, ridiculing me for having trust in human decency, which now I see was obviously misplaced. I haven't slept in 3 days. I honestly am fearing for my safety now, because they have my address. I fear for my business. I even fear for my life somewhat, and my family. I fear for my home as well, and my bank account. My friends too. My livelihood seems like it's on the line here as well. And I don't know, I just wish that this would stop. And to my cyber stalker, I know, yes, you're hearing this right now, but more than anything, I pity you. How sad you must be to derive your only joy from making an already broken man even more miserable. Have you had your fun? Are you happy with what you've done? A few years ago, I worked at a P.F. Chang's not too far from me. It wasn't a bad job too, as it was something to keep me busy and earn myself some money before starting my next semester of college. One night, it was just like any other night. Things were slowing down, and I was headed home, and I took the route that I normally took, and honestly nothing didn't seem really off that night or anything. Well, this wasn't until I noticed that I was the only car on the road. For clarification, my shifts typically ended around 10, and there aren't too many cars driving at the time, especially on the weekdays, but I would at least see a few pairs of headlights on my commute home. On that night, however, there weren't any. In fact, I distinctly remember that the night was eerily still and quiet, but I didn't really pay too much attention to it since I had my music playing through my car speakers. I was just sort of driving away, but little did I know that I was about to see something that I can only describe as something that clearly didn't belong. I turned onto the road that leads up to the stop sign turning into my development. At that very moment, my eyes immediately focused on something that was right in front of me. This creature was maybe about 2 or 3 car lengths away from me, so I got a pretty good look at it. The creature was on the road walking towards me on all fours head-on. If I could give a description of this thing, I would say that it looked like a dog, but something just didn't seem right. Like, first off, it was much too big to be a dog. You might say it might have just been a big dog, but I know that it couldn't have been. The sheer size of this thing just didn't make that possible, and secondly, by the way the creature walked. It didn't look at all natural. It was sort of in a crouch-like position, as if it walked like it was curious as to what I was doing, and if it was a dog or any other natural woodland creature, it would have moved as I approached, right? Like at least run away or something. It almost felt like it was pretending to be a dog, but the most distinct feature of all was that its eyes glowed either from its nocturnal nature, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they were glowing without my headlights reflecting off of them. Whatever it was light in color, probably gray, but my headlights didn't directly shine onto it, and it was partially in the dark as well. Keep in mind, I kept on driving forward while I was looking at it, and at that moment I just wanted to get the heck away from whatever that thing was. But when I made the turn into my development, I didn't look back because I just couldn't make myself to do it, and this might sound silly, but I was worried that it might have followed me home if I did. Thankfully it didn't seem to, but I can promise that that night I didn't get much sleep, and to this day it's always left an impression in my memory that I can just never shake. If what I saw was just a normal animal, then something was definitely wrong with it, but if it was what I thought it was, then there's no chance that it was an animal, and that that creature is possibly still lurking out there somewhere. Every so often I get the feeling when I drive that way that it may just be out there watching me too, which I know is probably just in my head, but still it's unnerving to say the least. I'm 22, and this happened to me when I was about 7. I've remembered this for years and nothing before, or since it's happened to me since then. I don't even think it was sleep paralysis too. In fact, I don't know what it was. What I do know is that I was fully awake when it happened, and I was able to move my body completely, but you can give some insight into what you might think it was. Demons? Sleep paralysis? Ghosts? My own mind? I don't know. I would like to know what you think. So when I was 7, my mom and dad, who are divorced, now used to live in this little gray house from 2007 to 2008. It was actually a pretty cute looking house, but my parents used to fight in it all the time, which seemed like it only started whenever we moved into this house. because weirdly before I only had happy memories of how my parents treated each other and didn't remember nearly as much violence that happened between my parents. I admit that it could just be that I don't remember their fights that took place before we moved into that house. However, I have a pretty good memory of everything else that's really specific during my childhood before that, like our trip to Disney World that we took in 2006. I specifically remember no fights between my parents happening the entire time that we were there. I can even remember the Kodak cameras my mom used to take pictures from back then. A white Disney-themed t-shirt that I remember wearing for the majority of our trip to this day. Seeing lots of lizards, me wanting to visit this one fake talking tree that had a face down there every day, etc. I have a pretty good memory that's vivid from like 5 and up, and so I don't think that I'm misunderstanding or misplacing the facts here. I even remember the specific apartments that we used to live in next to my mom's parents' place, my grandparents, before we moved into this house, and my experience that I'm about to talk about took place in. My mom has always said that my dad always was violent and had anger issues even before I was born when she met him, which I believe since to this day, he still sort of has outbursts of anger. However, nothing that I remember as bad as the fights that happened between him and my mom whenever we moved into this house back in 2007. There would be screaming matches daily between my parents, which I remember yelling at both of them to stop. My dad would also constantly go out drinking around this time period and come home constantly making scary threats towards my mom. He would even sleep with weapons which he threatened to use on my mom, but around this time I remember constantly feeling afraid and watched after my parents would tuck me into bed most of the time. What didn't help though was that they would always leave my door open, so I always felt like I was being watched by the pitch darkness between the hallway, my door, and at the other end of the hallway, where our spare bedroom, where our family computer was. You could say that it's pretty common for kids to be scared of the dark, I know, but I haven't gotten to my main experience yet. What I'm getting at is that it wasn't uncommon for me to wet the bed at this time, and go and wake my parents up to sleep with them as a result of my fear. On the night that my experience happened, this was one of those many times. Only I remember that my mom wasn't in bed, so I went to sleep with my dad. I can't remember exactly the reason why she wasn't there that night. In fact, I may not have known at the time. They might have already been separated around this time in the year, or my mom might have been out or something. But while me and my dad were in the middle of trying to lay down and go to sleep, I just remember that I couldn't fall asleep that night. I was laying down and so was my dad, but I couldn't just sleep, and at some point I remember Dad's little TV that he had on in his room flashing blue and making a sort of static noise. However, I remember I told my dad this, and he didn't believe me, and just told me to go to sleep. Eventually, after a few minutes, I started noticing what looked like these what I can only describe as creatures to the right side of me, both waddling on the bed towards me, and some to the right of me on the floor. I remember only one of them being on the bed, and it kept sort of, I don't know, like it seemed like it was endlessly waddling towards me, looking at me, and turning its head to the left on repeat. Two of the same creatures were on the floor, standing to the right of the bed. They all resembled penguins to me, but they were all pure gray and black. They seemed almost to be made of like pure static. You could make a sort of beak out of the body shape, as well as wings. However, I can't remember what their feet looked like exactly. At the same time that I saw them, I was also seeing and feeling other things in this room that shouldn't have been there. Like I eventually started feeling the sort of sensation of, I don't know, like worms crawling on my body, and I remember that I could also see them, as well, something like worms all over me. To my left on the wall, they looked to be what's hard to describe, but sort of like a giant strip of a lettuce-lined like creature that was moving with small little skinny, stringly little tentacles on the side, and like a purple mask in the center of it. This whole time I was telling my dad that I was seeing something, and I was making nervous whimpering noises like a scared kid does. But I remember he just kept saying that he didn't see anything that was going on. I think that he thought that I was fighting sleep or something, but I was genuinely seeing things, and at one point I tried waving my arm towards this waddling creature's body, but it just went straight through it. This all lasted for about an hour, as well from what I can remember, before they all slowly just started to sort of disappear. To this day, nothing similar has ever happened to me since or before that incident, so I'm convinced that I at least experienced something very strange. And I later found out that whenever we moved into that house from my mom years later, that every single couple who had lived there had apparently broken up. But I don't know if that's true or not. I'm really not sure how she would even know that, to be honest. But I also heard that the house was built on Indian burial grounds. Again, I don't know about all of that, but it's just rumors and hearsay. What I do know though is that the house has a bit of a strange reputation with people, that much is clear. but what do you guys think that I may have experienced back then when I was a kid? I'm dying to know if somebody else has experienced something like this. And if anybody has answers as to what this could be, then I would really love to know, because it's just such a strange and weird and creepy experience. It also feels like it wasn't long after this that's when I got stuck with chronic depression. It's still present, and it's something that I still battle with, but that's neither here or there for this story. Again, if you know anything about any of this, or have any theories or ideas or suggestions about what all this could be, then please do let me know. So my story comes when I first started dating my now husband. His name is B. We were both 20, and his parents had asked that we stay over at their house to house sit while they were away on vacation for a few days. I readily agreed because I knew that they'd have no problem with me bringing my dog, but they paid for food and bought groceries and lived closer to town than I do as well. So I was happy to do it even when we had to work, since I wasn't working at that time. It sounded super relaxing and was just what I needed at that time, and the first night went smoothly. It was a typical night. We had pizza and watched a movie, I think, and went to bed early because it was Sunday and we worked earlier the next day. I had a nightmare that night, but couldn't really remember it when I woke up, so it sort of made me anxious, but I couldn't put my finger on why. My dog Abby is an ESA, now retired since I have SD, and so she did her thing and was immensely helpful. I cleaned some, did some laundry for my mother-in-law since she was behind, and just sort of hung out. At some point I got a call around midday that B's cousin was dropping a dog off. There was a disagreement between her and her parents, and the dog was going to live with my in-laws from now on, and I thought, cool, I love that dog. Its name is Oakley. I was more than happy to take him in for them early. We came home and all was well. Now my in-laws have an entertainment system and bar in their basement, so we decided to go downstairs to watch our favorite shows for the night. My Abby girl went down, but Oakley would just not go downstairs. Plain refused to at the top of the stairs. He was so freaked out about the situation, he started shaking harder than I've ever seen a dog shake. He was petrified. I finally told B that we should just stay upstairs. It was no big deal, and as we ate I started to think about how Abby never let her guard down in the basement. She would always face the bathroom that they had down there, and would never leave my side. She would stand in front of me, and a few times she even growled. But it's an old house, I guess, so I figured that maybe she was hearing the house moving or something. I went to sleep that night, and that was the night that I had the most real and petrifying nightmare that I've ever had in my life, still to this day. I was laying in the bed that I had fallen asleep in. I looked up, and then at the wall across from me it was there. It was this black thing, and it smelt like death and tar. Extremely tall, bending in the middle to not hit its head. Its proportions were all wrong. Arms were way too long, legs too short and angled sort of awkwardly. It had long black hair that looked wet with how it clumped together. Black holes for eyes with blue lips. It was veining and made an awkward sort of sucking noise when it breathed. It had both dull and sharp teeth, almost like some were broken or something. But the worst part, believe it or not, was its limp. It made this sort of thud and dragging noise while it walked towards me laughing. Not a booming laugh, but sort of like an internal laugh, like when you're trying not to show someone that you're laughing. But its maniacal smile gave it away. It was excited, and I was scared. I started trying to scream, and at some point, I must have woken up, but when I did, he was still there, still coming towards me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and was sobbing. I kept trying to scream, but it felt I had a piano laying on my chest. Oakley came running from the living room and let out a huge snarl. I finally screamed, and I was so frantic I screamed for my mum, since I thought I couldn't get my husband's attention. But he flew up and turned on his side table light and looked at me, and when he did, it was gone. For a moment there, I honestly felt like I had just skirted by death. I called Oakley up on the bed, who was crying now, and trying to get closer to me. He laid in my lap and essentially just hugged me. My husband checked the entire house armed with a bat. He found my poor Abby locked in a bathroom crying and howling, as she had been with Oakley when we went to sleep, so I'm really not sure why or how she got locked in there. Once let out though, she came and immediately checked me out and traded places with Oakley. Oakley then went to look around with my husband. He checked everywhere with him except the basement. He again refused to go down, so my husband did a quick check and found no one down there. When he came upstairs, I explained that I just had to leave. I just had to get away from that house for a while, so I took the dogs and we went out for an early morning food run. Then we drove for a bit. It was snowing like crazy and probably not my best idea, but I still felt safer than I had at that house. I did end up going back. The next night was my last night, so I just didn't sleep and stayed on the couch with the dogs laying on near me. and I've never been so happy to leave somewhere, trust me. I no longer house sit for them, and they have heard the story. Don't get me wrong, I'm fine visiting for a few hours, but I can't do any more than that. I still feel watched to and stalked when I go there. You would think that his parents might find me a bit nutty, but the worst part of the whole thing is that when I told them, they weren't surprised. They knew exactly what I was talking about, so I could give you a million times as a kid or as a young adult that I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, don't get me wrong, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older because of forts and carvings that we would leave, and this one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us, but we got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to just wait until nightfall, do a bit of smoking, and play some Monopoly. For the sake of backstory on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters, and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants that you come across here. He had no fear of going, and camping out by himself too. If I spent like 10,000 hours in the woods, he must have spent like 50,000. As for me, I'm taller, a bit sturdier, and as we got older I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to really camp out alone, so I never really did it. In fact, older me wouldn't really go far at all when I was alone because I could never shake the feeling of being watched out there, which I know was just paranoia, but still it's an uneasy feeling anyways. The camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs some wood. Sun is down and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on his little chair that he always brought and loading up, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off of some of the logs that we'd gathered for the fire, when all of a sudden this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I sort of both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. When across from us on the other side of the fire we could hear footsteps, but they sounded like somebody was running and would slow down to a walk and then run again, but definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing sort of back and forth over the same spot. Then just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound of it that whatever this thing was, it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew that I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy," and when he did that I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him as well. I'd been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I'd heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid yet. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves, and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire, but we were in pure darkness too. But then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed some more leaves and brush, and threw it on the fire as quickly as we could. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off the spot or moved much for like over an hour, I think. Finally the leaves crunched, and whatever it was, it slowly walked off. Which means that whatever was there, it had sat there crouched watching us without moving for far longer than any animal I know would have. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared too, that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill of all things. Spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides some whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at that spot. We didn't go into the tent, and I had a very short light sleep sitting on the ground with my head resting on my hands. My friend never went to sleep, and in the morning we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, too, we talk about it often. In the 7 to 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since, and to be honest, I don't blame him. This was my experience with the big killer clown panic of 2016. I think about it all the time, and wonder what would have happened if I reacted differently and wasn't on my gut. So I, a 6 feet 2 inches male, was 16. I just bought my own car for like $1,000 from a buddy, and took any chance that I had to drive it literally anywhere. So one weekend I have a couple of days off work in a row. I decide I'm going to go drive an hour to the small town that I used to live in, and see some of my old friends that still live in there. It's about maybe 6 p.m. by the time that I get into town, and I start calling some of my friends. No one's really answering yet, so I go to my grandparents' house, and I say hi to them and just kill some time. Well, I'm there for a while, and not a single one of my friends is free tonight. I'm kind of bummed out. My family is just talking about how everyone is freaking out about the killer clown sightings, and whether it's real or not, and I'm over it, so I just decide to leave. Now it's about 8 p.m., just starting to get dark, and I stop at the only liquor or convenience store in town to get some cigarettes. I looked older than I was, and never got carded in this tiny town. Except the door is locked, and I don't see anyone or any lights when I peek in the door. That sucks, but whatever, I don't need cigs anyway. I do think it's a bit weird though, as I've never seen that store closed like once in my whole life. As I'm walking back to my car though, I notice that it's weirdly quiet even for this town. It was kind of foggy that night, so I can't see too far ahead of me, and of course I have killer clowns on the brain, so I get a little bit spooked. Then what seemed like out of nowhere, I see a woman come into view near where the road meets the liquor store lot. She's walking towards my car, the only car in sight, and shouts to me. I can't tell what she's saying at first, but she gets closer, and I make out bits and pieces. Apparently she's petrified by the rumors of killer clowns. She tells me that 2 kids were just murdered down the street at the high school by one of them literally half a mile from us. Obviously I don't really believe her, but I keep listening. She asks first if I can give her a ride to her house. Instantly I say no way. I know this town really loves drugs of all kinds, and I just don't trust it. She keeps asking though and won't leave me, so I say how about this, I'll drive on the shoulder behind, or next to you, as you walk home. So if anything happens I'll be there in my car. She says fine, and we start going. She's going super slow though. I have my hazards on, driving half on the shoulder down the country road, as she walks beside my open passenger side window. A couple of times she says something like, "Come on, can I just get in? I'm super scared." And I tell her that there are no killer clowns, there's no need to be scared, and I'm not going to risk my safety, and she shuts up. After maybe 10 minutes we turn down a dirt road that ends at a clearing, and I stop the car. She says, "Okay, I see my house from here," and I say, "Cool, see you later," but then she freaks out and says, "No, you have to walk me to my house." She points to a big old farmhouse about 150 feet in front of us through the clearing. I say, "No, I'm done. I told you that I'd help you get home, but we're here, but we can see your home right in front of us, and it just feels off." At this point she gets super weird, starts sort of rubbing her body up and down as if to be sort of sexy, and keeps asking please, and implies that she'll do something for me I want in exchange. I put it in reverse at this point, start backing up, and she literally puts her arms in and ducks her head into my driver's window and asks, sort of demands, that I give her any money that I have. I don't really have any, so I just sort of shove some change from the pocket in my door into a hand, and I peel out of there. As I'm backing up to the main road though, the whole time, she's just staring at me, not walking toward her house. I drive an hour home, and have been thinking about it since. I've always felt like if I walked up to a home that night, that there would have been more people waiting to do well, whatever they wanted to do with me. Thankfully I feel like I made a whole lot of right choices that night, and I made it out with just a spooky story. So I live in a rather old apartment complex that was built back when the suburb that I live in was more rural. Because of this, the complex property is rather large, with a lot of green space between each building, and all the buildings in the complex are arranged to be facing a large open courtyard type area. There are quite a few lights on the front of each building, but not many on the sides of the buildings, so the green spaces between each building are fairly dark at night. Anyway, so I took my dog out rather late one evening to give him one last opportunity to go to the bathroom before we went to sleep. Because it was so late, I decided to just hang around the green space next to my building instead of taking the dog for a proper walk around the courtyard area like I usually do. As I'm standing there while my dog heavily sniffs a patch of grass, I notice a guy dressed in all black walking on the opposite side of the courtyard. He sees me looking in his direction, and he turns into one of the green spaces next to a building on the opposite side. I can faintly see the outline of him, and I'm getting a little bit creeped out, because he looks to be just sort of standing there in the darkness doing nothing. After a few moments I notice him light up a cigarette, and I try and chill out, telling myself that he likely just needed a smoke, and is hiding out there to keep from being seen since my complex has a non-smoking policy. I go back to walking my dog around the green space next to my building, trying to coax him into doing his business. Eventually he finds a suitable spot and assumes position. I look away from him, and I notice the smoker has put his cigarette out, and he's now walking in a straight line across the courtyard, directly toward me, staring directly at me. I'm panicking now, kicking myself for not bringing anything to protect myself with, and for stupidly thinking who's going to mess with a woman walking an 80-pound dog. The 80-pound dog is currently crouching to do his business, and I'm not confident that he would stop to protect me. Suddenly, though, smoker guy takes a hard right and walks into the green space on the other side of the building to the right of my building. My dog finishes what he's doing, and I initially go to get a bag out to pick it up, but as I'm pretty freaked out, and I don't know where smoker guy is, I say to myself, you know what the heck with this, and run back to my apartment and lock the door. I go over to the window that faces the area that I was just in, and peek out just in time to see the smoker guy come out of the darkness right behind where I was standing. He had gone through the green space and behind the neighboring building, so that he could obviously come up behind me where I was standing. I stood motionless next to the window watching him, as he stood there for a second, and then began looking around by the front of the buildings, I assumed trying to see if I was still outside. Eventually he started walking back toward the courtyard, and I grabbed my phone and called the cops. I haven't seen him since then, but I am worried that he lives in one of the buildings in my complex. I don't take my dog out that late anymore, and have started carrying pepper spray with me on our walks. Hopefully I never need to use it, but better to be safe than sorry, right? It was the fall of 2009, and at the time I was 16 years old. I live in the central part of North Carolina, and nowadays the cities are loaded with things to do for Halloween season. But back then the most form of entertainment that I could come up with was to visit the Devil's Tramping Ground with a few friends. The Devil's Tramping Ground is a local legend, and it was about an hour away from where I lived, and I just got my license, so why not? For those of you who are unfamiliar with the locale or its legend, the Devil's Tramping Ground is a perfect circular spot of dead soil in the middle of the woods, and despite the greenery around it, nothing grows in that circle. The legend says that if you drop or leave anything in the circle, it's moved, and or disappears by morning, as the devil supposedly comes here to plot his evil doings against humanity late at night, pacing in a circle as he thinks. That's basically the gist of it, but feel free to do a little bit of research if you're interested, because it's a decent read. The city is a sticks and barns town with long barren roads that seemingly translate to don't stop until you get the heck out of here. It was one such road too, where I began to feel uneasy. Rural areas always have that heavy sort of Twilight Zone energy, and the road that we were on, conveniently titled Devil's Tramping Ground Road, was completely lacking street lights. The only thing illuminating the overworked asphalt was the fading yellow headlights of my 2002 Mercury Cougar and the useless glow of a crescent moon. In those dim lights, we began to see splattered graffiti on the road leading up to the location. Creepy things that I really didn't expect, I guess, but never really would have understood the impact of until I saw them. In white paint, the road was decorated in crude warnings. The one that I remember the most was "The Devil Lives Here," and a huge white cross in front of an opening in the forest. I parked on the side of the road though. The grounds were immediately not as creepy as I expected, to be honest. It was not too deep into the woods either. In fact, the clearing could be made out from the road pretty much. Not as menacing as I had imagined. Maybe it was the empty beer cans or red Solo cups lying all around. Obviously people partied there. Maybe it was the jokes my friends and I started making almost immediately that calmed my nerves. But it was 2-something in the morning. We decided to catch Lucifer right on his hour, and I remember feeling less on edge than I was on the road. My flashlight would get eaten through the trees if I moved it upwards, so I focused its beam on the soil, truly more interested in finding signs of the paranormal than my friends were. It was 4 of us total. 2 of my friends went back to the car after a while as well. It was cold and there was not much to see really, so I stayed back with a buddy of mine. I brought Ziplocs with me along with a pocket Bible, a rosary in my pocket just in case, and a stuffed rabbit that one of my best friends had given me. Before leaving, I scooped up some dirt and added it to the Ziploc. I know that might sound a little weird, but I found the prospect of completely dead soil really interesting, and figured that maybe studying under proper light compared to other soil would give me a better idea of what maybe happened here. Alien radiation maybe? Climate change? Sulfur? Maybe the devil was just busy that night. In between all the jokes and complaining about the cold, though, we suddenly heard someone walking in the depths of the woods. This wasn't a mistaken sound too. This was I think someone is walking in the woods sound. It was definite, and it was a definite feeling too. This was deep behind between the trees, and these steps were heavy and unashamed of being heard. And I think it was at this point that this was the first time that I noticed no crickets were in these woods. There was no sound in fact other than us, and these steps, and I was even more unwilling to lift my little flashlight, which was tucked under my armpit now and pointed towards my soil sample. My eyes didn't need adjusting, and so we sort of stood there as I made out the shape of, well, something in those woods. It was dark, but I could definitely see it. It was tall, but not disgustingly tall, I guess. It was human-shaped. It definitely stood on 2 feet. It would walk, and then sort of stop in a pattern. I think it was coming towards us, but it was at this point that we were petrified, and either my friend or I moved a muscle. I don't even think we breathed. I was so overcome with fear that I felt numb, that a little tremble ran through my entire body, and we just sort of, well, stood there and stared. Later we would discuss how we both wondered if it had seen us, and talk about how we didn't want to move in case it hadn't, and at this future time we would also discuss the smell. It was awful. A putrid scent. Burning feces. Rotten eggs. Rotten meat. It was something like that. I grew up a Catholic, hence the Bible and the Rosary, and have always been told that smell means the devil is around, and having all this at the back of my mind at that point certainly didn't help. This thing stayed there too, toying with us among the sticks of the forest. I say sticks because at the time very little greenery was actually alive. I was certain at one point that it saw me too. I had that sort of sixth sense feeling I was being stared right back at, and suddenly I had the weirdest feeling. A feeling of overwhelming, unbearable despair. I realized then that my friend had been clutching the back collar of my shirt. I think I was so paralyzed with fear that I had ceased to feel anything but that numbness. I wasn't even cold anymore, but when I felt my friend's hand, I just dropped everything in my arms, stood up and hauled my butt back to the car. Not running, but just very hurried. I was sure that my friend was behind me, but between us, and in all honesty, I didn't even think about it at that time. I just wanted to get out of there, and I was ready to go. In fact, I was so ready to go that I missed the clear path completely, and took off between trees and brush heading towards the yellow glow of the headlights. It wasn't an incredibly long trek, or anything like I said before. The road was right there, but it felt awful and really long to me because I did this, and it was enough for those tiny branches to leave little scrapes, and even some cuts down my hands, cheeks, and neck, and although retelling this story makes it seem like it went on for a long time, but this whole ordeal couldn't have lasted very long. When I go back to my car, though, the keys were already in the ignition. The other 2 friends had the heat on, and they both asked me what happened. The friend who stayed behind with me got in the passenger seat soon after, and we took off. Our other friends, the ones who had been in the car, suddenly pointed out, though, that our eyes were swollen and like bright red. I think maybe we'd been crying, or at least it looked like had been. I looked in the rearview mirror, and my pupils as well were like abnormally dilated. My eyelids were puffy and tender and red. Keep in mind this could all have some form of explanation. Maybe the fear made us cry without us knowing, and maybe the darkness combined with our nervous reactions enlarged our pupils. Maybe the dirt did something, but the whole thing was still very odd. I realized long after that I actually left my Bible there, my stuffed rabbit, and my Ziploc bag of dirt in the circle. I considered going back the next day in broad daylight, but I haven't been back since. Oddly enough, too, I still wonder and worry about what or whom might have my stuff. So a few years ago I worked in a military prison, and our hours were 24-hour shifts that consisted of shared downtimes, sleep time between the shifts. One half stays awake, the other half sleeps, then switches halfway through the night. Now I've been working at this prison for a while by this point, and I was currently working in our special quarters. Our SQ was just a long loop with all the cells on the inside of the loop. Every 15 minutes I had to do a health and comfort check, and basically walk by each cell making sure the inmates are alive and healthy. Every cell has a security light, so even at nighttime the cells are never truly black, so we can see inside. One specific inmate that I remember was in special quarters because he was mentally not all there. His favorite thing to do was draw, scream all day, pee outside the cell, and sleep. One day we had to do a cell extraction on him because he was clawing at his gums with his fingernails and using the blood from them to draw symbols all over his cell wall. The medical was looking at him on the spot while I was going through his cell to check for contraband and stuff. Looking through his drawings, he would always make childlike sketches of him playing games with his brother and a creepy shadowy silhouette of a person. His name was over his drawing of himself, his brother's over his, and dark one over the shadowy one. Cheesy, I know, but that's what was there. While looking through these drawings, he looked at me and said he doesn't like me being in there. I suddenly felt the hair raise on my arms, and I walked right out. Keep in mind I'm regularly told this weird stuff by inmates, and it never bothers any seasoned officer like me except this one time. Anyway, fast forward a couple of weeks, and it's probably around 2 a.m., and I'm awake while my partner is asleep. During every 15-minute check I noticed every cell's security light was on as normal, otherwise I would have to write a report about it. I was sitting in the little cell that we use for our food for the day, just eating, and all of a sudden I hear this extremely loud screaming. I could not make out what the screaming was, or what even language it was, but my arm hairs raised again, and I ran to find the source, and every single inmate was sound asleep. But what caught my attention was that strange inmate security light was out, and there was no way that they would be able to mess with the lights the way that they were installed. I quickly yelled to another officer in the other bays if they heard that screaming, thinking that maybe it came from one of their bays, but not one of the other officers heard the screaming. I apparently was the only one that did, but there was something off about that guy, and since that day I always requested to never be posted in there again, even though it was one of the most sought-after posts. I guess something just really bothered me about that night. So back in 2017, my girlfriend and I were in a sort of semi-long distance relationship. I lived in the Orlando area, and she in Tampa. I would frequently travel by a megabus to Tampa, but to see her and for concerts and stuff, but shortly after this experience, I switched exclusively to Amtrak, and didn't regret having to pay 1 cent more. On this day, however, I had picked up Wendy's before the trip for dinner, and had made my way to the boarding area. I noticed a sort of disheveled older man glaring at me openly. I didn't acknowledge him, and instead boarded the bus. I sat near the back of the bus, placed my own backpack on the seat next to me, and opened my food. As I was eating, I noticed that this same man who had been glaring had boarded, and sat across the aisle from me in the seat closest to the aisle, same as me. We had about, I would guess, 2 feet of separation at this point, and while the bus takes off, and we're soon on the interstate headed west. Every time I look a bit at my food, he would sort of grumble though. Then he started raising his voice a bit, and motioning to me. Then he started near shouting and pointing at my wrapper. I had headphones in, and was comfortably ignoring him by this point. I'd worked a full shift at work that day, had headed home, showered, changed, grabbed my packed bag and headed out. So I was really tired and sort of hungry, but as I finished my food, balled up the wrappers, and tossed them back into the bag, he just became nothing short of like irate, shrieking in Spanish, I think, and reached over to me, grabbing the bag and looking inside. When he saw that it was empty, he began screaming at me, and I bluntly told him to shut up, it was my food. At that he went silent for a bit, until I saw him rummaging in his bag. He then slipped the hatchet out of his bag, laid it across his lap, and smirked at me. My blood ran cold. Now I'm a big guy, 6 feet 3 inches, 300, but in that small space, and dealing with a weapon-wielding maniac, I knew that there was not much that I could do. I immediately stood up, walked to the driver, and told him what had happened. The next stop was Lakeland, and we were still about 45 minutes away, which was the only way that he could do something. I went back to my seat, grabbed my backpack, and fled to the upper level, sitting close to the window at the far back. Eventually, when we got to Lakeland, I saw him get approached and escorted off the bus. As he stepped off, he stumbled and fell, which is when I realized that he was also completely drunk or on something. I'm really glad that he didn't get the opportunity to hurt anyone on that bus, and I can only hope that he was detained after or separated from his weapon. But for as long as I live, I will never forget that smirk. In my younger days, just after high school, I was what you would probably consider a vagrant. A home to speak of, but not quite homeless either, I guess. Growing up poor in a poor, dying factory town assures a few things, but most of the kids in my town knew and understood clearly that the only way to escape such a bleak place was to leave. Find work somewhere else, and don't come back unless you want to be trapped forever, and I was no exception to this understanding. It was the result of this desperate retreat from certain poverty that led me to work as a laborer in the pipeline industry. Grueling work, but decent pay, a fair start for one such as myself. After about 3 months of working, my foreman, who we'll call Jay, discovered that I was staying at a motel and wouldn't have it. He was kind enough to invite me to stay with his family until I found an apartment, and I was grateful for his offer. Jay and his family were honest rural people who lived in an honest rural area as well. A house with a barn in the field surrounded by the wooded hills. No neighbors and one road in and out. Very similar to houses I had seen and been around growing up, to be honest. It was a great area and great company too, and I was thankful for such a turn in my luck. The first evening I stayed there, Jay's wife got me situated in my room, and I became acquainted with everyone in the house over dinner. After our meal, I stepped out for a cigarette and decided the tree line behind their barn would be the best area to smoke privately and inoffensively. The sun had set, and then some by the time that I stepped out of the house. The moon was high and full, keeping the valley that I was in. dully illuminated and casting the surrounding hills as dark shadows against the star-filled sky. It was a night that I think most would find peaceful, but as soon as my boots met the grass, that primal instinctive warning that a man gets sometimes began to slowly creep into my core. That alarm that tells you that something just ain't right here. Being young and dumb and brave, of course, I shrugged it off though, and continued to the tree line, attempting to keep the growing feeling at bay. When I at last approached the shadowed tangle of trees and underbrush on the outskirts of their yard, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my pack of Marlboros and my matches, and struck it alight. As I brought the match to my cigarette, though, that was when I saw it. Mere feet away from where I was standing, just barely within the trees, was the stark and outstanding silhouette of something huge. It stood crouched and still had to be at least 7 feet tall, large pointed ears and narrowly elongated snout. Its eyes glimmered, that weird sort of infrared color you see when animals reflect light in their eyes at night. My initial panic-stricken thoughts were that as a wolf. It was in the midst of this processing that I realized too, that there was no way that this actually was a wolf, because wolves, they don't stand upright, and this creature was unmistakably on 2 legs. It was slouched low, one arm hung down past its haunches, and the other was pressed firmly against the tree to the right of it. Broad shoulders and a savage posture, it didn't move. It didn't seem startled or threatened, or even afraid, but simply aware. It knew that I saw it, and it knew that I knew. I wish I could say that I did something, anything. I wish I could say that I ran, or that I screamed, or even moved, but I was just completely frozen in fear, standing rigid as a statue with nothing but a quickly dying matchlight between me and whatever monstrous thing was in front of me. We seemed to lock eyes for what felt like hours, but was really probably only moments, and as though the creature had decided it was done terrifying me, it straightened up, backed away slowly into the darkness of the trees. No sound, not a broken twig or even a rustled leaf was heard. As soon as my legs allowed me, I ran like heck back to the safety of Jay's house, slammed the door behind me, and was met with a look of concern from my foreman and his wife, who were watching TV in the living room. I immediately said, "Guys, there's something out there." It was the only thing that I could gasp. Jay exchanged a glance with his wife and looked back towards me. "Listen, boy, if you're going to stay here, you need to understand that there's things out in them woods that you best not pay attention to, all right." He said it so nonchalantly, like he was talking about last night's football game. You hear a strange noise, you ignore it. You see a strange shadow, just ignore it, and if you get a strange feeling, just come inside and forget you felt it. That there are things out there we just don't understand, but we respect it, because it's their land, we just live here. It's been 15 years since my encounter with that creature in the woods, and I still think about it often. And though I stayed with Jay and his family for another 3 weeks after that night, I never felt easy on that property. That feeling never left, that warning stayed alert, and I will never go out to those woods at night unless I have absolutely no other choice. Once you know what's out there, you never see things the same again, and I know that this might seem far-fetched. I know that many won't believe what I'm saying, but this is a story that I had to share. So this is the first time I was living alone in my apartment. I was walking out to my car to attend an evening church service when I hear this guy saying, "Hey, hello, can you help me?" I'm standing about maybe 10 feet away, and when I stop to observe, it's a man in a wheelchair. He has 1 sack of groceries in his lap, and 2 on the ground beside him. He had on what looked like a veteran attire, I think, combat boots, but what stood out to me the most is I noticed how incredibly built or buff he was. Not just his arms too, but his calves, and at that the hairs on my arms and neck instantly stood up. I guess while silently observing him, he was waiting for me to walk up to him. I sort of took a few steps back and shook my head. His immediate response was, "I'm not going to do anything to you. Can't you see I'm in a wheelchair?" He then pointed to his door and said, "Look, I just need help putting the bags inside my door on the floor, that's all." I declined politely and began to walk away. The screaming, cursing, and insults what made me basically run to my car in the end. Safe in my car with the doors locked, I couldn't shake that awful feeling off of me though. Fast forward to a couple of days later as I'm driving down the street headed home. Who do I see walking without a limp cane or with any visible disability? Yep, it was him. My heart instantly dropped. I stayed in my apartment for a week after that and had a male friend walk me to my car when I got off work, because I was too scared to be by myself in case of any more encounters, I guess. To this day, this strange encounter still haunts me. I went through the 22 weeks infantry OSUT, and the worst experience that I had was the individual night land nav. I was in the middle of the swamp around 2 a.m. looking at my map, when suddenly every hair on my body stood on end, and my red light flickered. I turn it off and start looking around when I spot the silhouette of a woman in what I can only describe as a pioneer's outfit. I looked away for a second and looked back and nothing. I told myself that I must have been seeing things, picked a direction I thought was good, and started walking. I start hearing the crunching and breaking of leaves in rhythm with my steps behind me, though as if someone was watching my pace, and my hair stood up again. I stopped, looked behind me, nothing. I continued walking, same thing happened, looked again and nothing. I decided that 3 points were plenty for tonight and started booking it. As I'm running, I clearly hear and see something jumping from tree to tree above me, keeping pace as I cut through the woods sprinting full speed. I'm not the fastest by any means, but at the same time, I had a 13.45 and have 5 seconds 40 yards. Nothing could have moved that quickly through those trees like that. I make it to the starting point, turn in my stuff, and I sit on my gear. Another guy comes running in about 15 minutes later. We still have 2 hours left at this point, so it makes no sense why he would be in a hurry. He does his stuff and sits next to me. He turns to me and says, "Dude, did you have point in the swamp?" I gesture at my boots and pants, and yeah, can't you tell? Sorry, better. Anyway, did you see a woman in a pioneer outfit? Yeah, I was writing down my points info when my lights started flickering, and I heard something in the tree above me. I looked up and saw her sitting in a tree above the point, just sort of staring down at me with lifeless eyes and an empty face. I ran and didn't stop till I got here. It's at this point where the guy sitting behind us leans forward. "You all saw her too?" We nod. I started walking into the swamp when I saw her sit up out of the water and slowly turned to look at me. I froze and I only broke out of it when the lieutenant walked up behind me and asked what I was looking at. I looked at him and pointed, but when I did, she was gone. No noise, nothing. Now this kid was an honest dude, and I could tell by the look in his eyes that he wasn't messing with us. I want to know though if anyone else has had an experience with something like this. It's something that I'm pondering a lot lately, and I don't know, I just can't get it off my mind. So last night I was watching a video, and it brought up a memory that my brain must have blocked out for years, and now I'm sort of haunted by it again. You see, I was 13 years old hanging out with my best friend. We lived in a small town in Wisconsin, and it was the 90s, so there wasn't much to do. No smartphones at that time, so we would always walk around town and play in the woods. On this day we decided to walk to the railroad tracks. We chat about boys, and have a bunch of giggles while getting to the wooded area of the tracks that go on until the next town like miles away. And it must have been about maybe halfway into our journey I hear a baby crying. I look at my friend as we continue our stride thinking that she would have had some sort of facial expression acknowledging it, but no. I kept on walking for another minute, just silently asking myself why there's a baby crying. Finally I just sort of stop and look at my friend and say, "Why is there a baby crying? We're out in the woods, where's it coming from?" My friend looks at me with a confused face, and to my dismay she says, "What are you talking about?" I didn't hear anything. She laughs at me, and we continue our stride. Mind you, I still hear this constant wailing of a baby. As we're walking I have like 10 billion questions going on in my head, and become increasingly agitated as this crying wouldn't stop until it became a sheer, almost painful loud screaming. And it was at that point again where I stopped dead in my tracks, pulled my friend's arm, and I just burst into tears. You have to hear that. Where is it? Where is its mum? It sounded like it could be hurt. My friend treated me like I was a lunatic and continued to make a point that she hasn't heard anything. While we're arguing the crying stops. A sigh of relief, I sort of shift my head down in disbelief of it all. Looking at my feet, I then noticed that I was standing on something in the gravel of the middle of the tracks. I said, "What's that?" Pulled on the scrap that was visible to reveal something that gave me instant chills down my spine. It was a baby's onesie, tatted up and sort of ruined. I immediately felt sick to my stomach. My friend's eyes got wide and I said, "Let's get out of here," and we never went back. I don't know what I experienced that day, or why it's been blocked from my memory for like 15 years, but it truly terrified me. Let me know what your opinion is about all of this, as I'm still at a loss to this day. So when I first moved to my current house like 10 years ago, I never really felt alone. Like there would always seem to be this feeling of someone being nearby, and the place was just incredibly ominous. It had a really weird atmosphere. You could hear distinct footsteps upstairs when nobody else was home, and movement in the shadows. I know it sounds cliché, but that's truly how it began. The basement was always worse than the rest of the house. There was just an incredibly strong, foreboding feeling whenever you passed the halfway mark of the stairs. It always felt like someone was right behind you, The door to the boiler room would always pop open and creak like an inch or two before just stopping. It didn't matter if you slammed the door or gently closed it, the door would always creak back open within the hour. Then there was the whispering that would happen if you ignored the door for too long, and as time passed the whispering began to happen to me even if I wasn't in the basement. The voice always changed depending on the circumstances though. If I was home alone, then it was always the voice of my family members calling my name, but when I called back the whisper would just keep repeating my name, beckoning me to come to the source of the sound until I went and investigated. Only then would the whispers stop. My house is a decent size, so if somebody isn't loud enough then they can sound like a distant whisper, which is why I kept investigating it. If I was not home alone, the whispers would be an inaudible but masculine voice that was always originating from right behind me. It didn't matter if I tried to play the TV really loud or if I wore headphones. The whispers were always audible, and that was the extent of the activity for around a year as well, until one day a tapping started in my closet. It was never random and always occurred in some type of a pattern like 3 taps or 4 taps, and it would start up randomly and end randomly too, but only when I would be home alone or between sunset and sundown. The tapping varied in length, lasting for a few minutes and restarted every few hours, or sometimes it would go for hours and then just stop for the remainder of the night. It was incredibly random. I thought it was maybe a leaky pipe or something of the sort, but there were no pipes in that part of the wall. My room was on the top floor, and there were no sinks or showers for 15+ feet, and no mold or water stains ever appeared on the wall of the closet or the ceiling beneath my room, but I was absolutely terrified to go to bed because of the sound. Around that time, too, my blanket began coming off in the middle of the night. I know that sounds like the result of basic restless sleeping, but it would always be neatly folded in a square on the floor by the foot of my bed. It was absolutely horrific to have to attempt to pull the blanket off the floor and unfold it while trying to cover myself again, while knowing that whatever did that could still be in the room. I began sleeping with my headphones on while playing natural white noise to make sleeping in that room easier, but it was still incredibly nerve-wracking. After a few months of getting used to the closet tapping, and learning to live with everything going on, whatever was in my house began to actively terrorize me during the daylight hours too. The way my house is designed, there's one big living room that is separated by sort of like a wall divider to give the illusion of creating 2 rooms, but there's no door or anything to block things or sounds. The entity or whatever it was would start scratching the carpet like a dog does on the opposite side of the divider room from me as well, and then slowly the scratching would come over to right in front of where I was. It didn't matter if I was on the couch or in a chair, it would come right in front of me and scratch until I reacted. If I moved to a different seating spot, it would follow me too. If I ignored it, then it wouldn't stop, but I admit that the longest I tried to ignore it was only like 30 minutes, so maybe if I held out then it would have stopped eventually. I don't know, but that would happen like every day until I learned that it would stop if I left the house. So I think it wanted to exercise its power over me, or something like it was letting me know that it owned the house, and I was simply being allowed to stay. But even if I left the house after the scratching, it would still happen again every 3 or 4 days like clockwork. I thought that I was absolutely crazy too, because no one else was experiencing things like this until one day when the scratching got too close to my dog, and he began to bark at it before running over to join me on the couch and growling at whatever it was as it got closer. I complained to my mom and siblings, told them that it didn't like the dogs and that I was scared to go home after school, but I used to have a very active imagination, so they would tell me to be quiet or stop talking crazy. My faith in my mom was absolutely shattered and still has never truly recovered after being dismissed so many times. All she would do was wave her hand and say, "In the name of Jesus, you're safe," and tell me to go away. After around 3 years of living in that house too, around a year after the scratching began, years after the closet tapping began, the tapping started happening in the closet at my father's house as well, so I'm pretty sure that whatever it was must have been attached to me for some reason. I tried praying. I tried never being home alone. I even forced myself to get rid of my imagination to end the terror, but nothing changed. In fact, it wasn't until my brother told my mom that he converted religions that my mother blessed the house with holy anointed oil. She dipped her finger in oil and put a cross on every doorway in the house to force out his evil spirits that made him doubt Christianity, but it finally actually stopped. The door opening, the shadows, the scratching, the whispers, they actually stopped that day, but the occasional ominous feeling and the footsteps both happen occasionally, and to be honest, I'm pretty fine with that. So that's the background, but not too long ago, I feel like it's been picking up again. You see, I had my college dorm mate come home with me one day since there were no flights back to his country due to them closing their borders, and he began investigating the occult, while in my home not with a Ouija board, or anything, just doing sort of like basic research, and all that, and I don't know what happened, but maybe he sort of like reawakened something. While that roommate was still at my house, he began saying that he felt uncomfortable being alone in any room in that house, and began walking around with headphones. After he left my house to stay elsewhere, the ominous feeling began to return more frequently than it has for like the past 6 or 7 years. I even began to see things dart around corners or move around in the dark really quick every now and then, but this time it's more physical as well. You see, a little while after the activity began to pick up again, I was sleeping in my sister's old room alone, and something cold grazed my back. Obviously I woke up, looked around, and after not seeing anything I just laid back down. I assumed for some reason that it must have been the AC vent or something, but I was tired and forgot that the AC doesn't actually work in that room. Just as I was about to fall asleep again, as well, it gently stroked my back again. That time though, there was no mistaking it. It felt like 4 small petite fingers glided across the entirety of my back from my shoulder to just a few inches above my butt. I immediately went under the blanket, and it stopped, but I was awake by that point. I eventually calmed myself down by thinking about it, and I concluded that it was different from the haunting that I had as a child. Whatever touched me seemed, I don't know, feminine, and almost caring or gentle, like it hadn't meant to frighten me. A few nights later, I began to hear footsteps leading up to the second bed in the room. After my sister left, we had a second bed in there, so the guests could stay over if they so desired, and all that, and then the footsteps would stop before I heard sounds similar to someone sitting on the bed and adjusting themselves. I saw nothing and didn't feel threatened, so I don't know why, but I just sort of began talking about what I was doing and how I was feeling, and after a few minutes of that I saw the bed spring up and heard the sound of the bed springs resetting before the sound of footsteps went back towards the door and stopped. It was at that point that I got a little bit nervous, because I couldn't chalk it up to me being a little crazy, but I wasn't truly frightened or anything. That exact thing began to happen every few days or so as well, typically when I was getting ready for bed, so I just sort of made a routine of greeting it and talking aloud of my thoughts. And after a few weeks of this, however, the activity changed, and I didn't like it at all. I was minding my own business and relaxing when the bedroom door began to shake like someone was grabbing the handle and twisting it, but not opening it while shaking it violently. In the past, the door would shake occasionally if like a semi-truck passed by in the neighborhood, but this was way more intense of a rattling, and I have exercise bands on the door, which have never rattled with the door before, but they did this time, which startled me because that never happens. I yelled at whatever it was shaking the door to get lost, and it stopped for a minute before the door started rattling again, but softer this time. I yelled out enough, I acknowledged that you're in there, and I walked over to the door, grabbing the doorknob, and started shaking it back. I stood there for a moment to see if there would be a response, but the shaking ended. Since this event, I had my mother pray in that room, and bless it, since she has become a much more devout person than I am, and all the activity in that room ceased. At this point, I began to remember everything, and I decided to ask around since I was older now, and my words would be more respected. I talked to my mom about it, and she said that something shook her bed once, but she told it to leave her alone in the name of Jesus, and apparently it stopped. But she also said that while I was complaining to her about the ghost stuff, that my sister had been telling her about a man in a fedora-type hat that would stand in the corner and shadow figures in the dark before the house was blessed the first time, but claims that she never mentioned it. After that, I have a theory, though, that maybe she had paranormal experiences that never went away, and that's what caused her to go off the deep end and start doing illicit substances and running around the streets at all hours. Due to her past actions, I'm pretty low contact with that sister, but in my pursuit of answers, I am thinking about writing her a letter to ask her about all this. My other sister, however, claims that when she lived in the basement, that she hated being there alone, because it felt like someone was always watching her, especially when she was in the shower or trying to sleep. She stayed out of the house as often as possible, or would have boys over just so that she wouldn't be home alone, and after around 6 months to a year, before I began spending a lot of my own time in the basement, she got pregnant and ended up moving out. She said that never mentioned it to anyone because she didn't want to sound crazy or scare us, since my siblings and I were so much younger than her. My brother claims that he's experienced nothing and tries to logic everything away, I guess, which is a good thing. But if you confront him with undeniable proof, or something happens, when he was also present, but we witnessed the carpet scratching once and ran upstairs before locking ourselves in our rooms. He will deny it ever happened and refuse to talk about it, but he's always been the type to try and conceal and hide everything that happens to him, that he feels. So I don't expect him to really answer my questions honestly anytime soon, but I definitely want to find answers, and to end this once and for all if I can, that is. My nephews want to start spending the night with me, and I want to make sure that they never experience the things that I did, and I guess that's why I'm really questioning everything again. I'll definitely update you guys once I write that letter to my sister, and if she replies, but in the meantime, thanks for listening. So I was walking my dog in the rain the other day. It was about 6:30. A man comes up to me, and he's wearing a red jacket, seems to be in his maybe 40s or 50s, he's missing a few teeth. But he greets my dog, and we talk about him. He gives me a chew toy, and we play with the dog for a bit. As I'm about to leave, I give him the chew toy back, and he insists that I keep it. After a few minutes of back and forth, I decide to drop it and take the ball. I thank him and wish him good night. I get home and examine the chew toy closer and take out the squeak cap, and inside, I see a chip that's blinking with a red color. I immediately grab a pen and pick the chip out and snap it into. My mind is filled with a lot of questions about why this happened and what I should do about it, so I post a picture of it on Reddit, and I'm told by an electrical engineer that this looks a lot like a tracking chip. Why a tracking chip would be in a dog toy, I have no idea, but do you think I should contact the police about this, or do you think that I'm just overreacting? I unfortunately had to move back with my family after my most recent breakup. He and I were living in Boston together in an apartment we got. Just a little word of advice: never sign a lease with someone who you recently got into a relationship with. He was not the person I thought he was. My parents live in western Massachusetts. If you've ever been to Massachusetts, you'd know the more west you get, typically the more rural it gets. I'm not a big country girl. I like to be in or near a major city, especially since I'm in my 20s still. My parents' area is super boring. I'm hoping I'm only here temporarily until I find another apartment I can afford myself, though I'll be staying away from Boston for reasons. I had to get a job back at the urgent care facility I used to work at before I moved. They welcomed me back excitedly, even if it is just temporarily until I move again. The trade-off with this job, though, is that I tend to work undesirable hours, meaning overnights. Though the shifts are easy, they're boring, and they entirely mess up my sleep schedule and social life. Not that social life is even the best around here. After my shifts, sometimes I'll stop for what's considered my dinner, usually takeout since not much is open at these hours. Though this morning, I got out at 4 a.m., and there's a bagel place that opens at that time, and they serve a lot of types of food. So I stopped by there and grabbed a chicken sandwich and a salad. I was going to eat it once I got home. I also had to make a pit stop for gas as well. I stopped at the local Shell station, one of the few gas stations open at this hour, that was on the way home. The parking lot for this station is huge, and yet I hardly ever see any other cars in there even during the day. I went inside to pay cash to save a little money. I went back outside to the pump, and there was now another car at one of the other pumps. It was a blue sedan. A guy got out of the car as I was walking over to the pump I was at. As I began fueling, I noticed him start to fuel up as well. I guess he locked the handle in place so that it would automatically keep dispensing gas without him holding it, because he walked through the two pumps to my side, and then said to me, "Want to see a funny trick?" I immediately hated this interaction. Still, for some reason, I said, "What's the trick?" He then started doing that stupid old trick where you pretend you're pulling your finger off with your other hand by just folding it down. He kept looking down at his hands, and then back at me with this kind of sarcastic looking expression, as if he knew what he was doing was stupid, but honestly I couldn't tell. I fake laughed so that he'd go away, but he didn't stop. He kept doing the trick even after I looked away, and tried my best to pretend not to notice anymore. When I felt the click of the gas nozzle indicating that the tank was full, I was so relieved. I quickly relatched the nozzle to the pump and hurried inside for my change. When I came back outside, the man wasn't in sight anymore, yet his car was still there, and the hose was still pumping gas into his car. I didn't want to stick around to catch his attention again. I got back in my car, though just out of paranoia. I checked the back seats just to make sure he wasn't hiding back there. I locked the doors, and then I was back on the road. I was home in about 5 minutes after that. I was so excited to eat my 4:30 a.m. dinner. I picked up the spare from my parents' hiding spot, unlocked the door, and then quickly hid it back in its hiding spot. I locked the door once I entered, as I always do. I went straight to the kitchen to eat. I make sure to be quiet when I get home late, so as not to wake up my parents. We only have 2 cars in the family, so I share my mom's car. I didn't need a car in Boston anyway, but since I moved back, I had just been using the hidden spare key they would hide in the front to let myself in. As I was at the table eating, I heard the front door being unlocked, and then opening and closing. I stopped chewing and froze to listen. With a mouth full of food, I said, "Mom? Dad?" No answer. I didn't hear any footsteps or anything. I hurried out of the kitchen to take a peek in the foyer. No one was in there. I felt like my heart was in my throat. I ran up the stairs to my parents' room and barged in. I was horrified to see both my parents in bed, and they were both awoken to my very forceful opening of the door. I said very quietly, but in a clear panic, that someone just came inside the house. My dad jumped out of bed and hurried downstairs. I cautiously followed behind him. He turned on all the lights of every room we passed. Then he went out front to check for the spare key, and it was missing. My mom and I were absolutely horrified, yet my mom still found the time to lecture me for not checking my surroundings before re-hiding the key. My dad began searching every room in the house, and we followed. When he was done checking my older brother's room, he left to continue searching and left the lights on in here. I stayed behind in this room and decided to check a couple of the spots that I felt my dad had missed, because I know internally I didn't expect to find anyone. I checked under the bed, and then I checked the closets. Nothing. So I went downstairs to the main floor. It seemed my dad was already checking the basement. I was honestly horrified to go into the basement right now, even with my dad down there, so I stayed on the middle floor with my mom. But curiosity still got me, and I went to the dining room, which is adjacent to the foyer by the front door. I got down on my knees and looked under the table, and there he was. It truly did not feel real. There was that man from the gas station, hiding under the dining room table. I recognized him instantly. I screamed as loud as I could, and in response, my mom started to scream too. My 65-year-old dad came up the stairs as fast as he could, ready to fight this intruder. The man came out from under the table and began fending off my dad, who was at least 20 years his senior. And as my mom and I saw him overpowering my dad, we began doing whatever we could as well, hitting and punching at the man as my dad still held on to him. It was when all three of us were attacking him that he finally decided to retreat and fled through the front door. This was when we called the cops, and thank God for a quick response time. However, that man still had the key to the front door. That night, the police left a police car parked in our driveway to deter that man from coming back. My dad wedged a chair in front of the front door as well, and slept in the living room. The next day, he switched out the lock to the front door, and with that, my parents' days of hiding a key outside were over. I do feel guilty for bringing that dangerous man to my parents' house, and it was definitely on me for being careless. But honestly, I think that man followed me with his headlights off because I didn't see any cars behind me the entire ride home. I'm happy for my and my family's safety though. However, this just made me want to move out of here even more. I like driving at night because there's nothing more that I hate than driving in traffic. I'm from New York, Long Island specifically, and the traffic here is truly unbearable. My brother lives in Florida, and I like to go down and visit pretty often. It's a long drive though. Depending on when you leave, it could be upwards of 18 hours. I like to leave New York very early in the morning, like 2 a.m., so that I could be out of all the high traffic areas by the time any cars are on the road. So it was a Thursday morning at 2 a.m. that I was leaving home to get on the road. I stopped for my morning coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, knowing I had a long, grueling drive ahead of me. The reason I was driving and not flying was because I was going to be down there for a whole month, and I didn't want to rely on my brother to take me everywhere I needed to go. By the time I was off of Long Island, it was after 3 a.m. It was smooth sailing from Jersey. The drive from New York to Florida is very easy once you're out of New York. You take the I-95 all the way down. At about 4 a.m., the hunger was starting to set in, and so I pulled off the I-95 at the first sign of a food sign. I saw Wendy's on the sign, and so I figured I'd get breakfast from there. I skipped breakfast at the house, because waking up so early, I feel like your brain doesn't have a chance to realize how hungry you are for a few hours. At least that's me personally. I followed the signs to the Wendy's. I was in some random spot in Jersey. There were no street lights here. I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. Just about the only light was from my headlights. When I got to the Wendy's parking lot, some of the lights were on, and I saw a car in the parking lot, so I pulled into the drive-thru. The menu in the drive-thru was lit up, so I thought it was open, but I sat there for over a minute looking at the intercom, waiting for someone to greet me, but they didn't. I even said excuse me to no avail. I pulled out my phone and looked up this Wendy's, and wouldn't you know it, It didn't open until 6 a.m. And then, suddenly, 3 knocks at my window almost sent me out of my seat. I turned to my right, and there was a man outside my window smiling. He motioned for me to lower the window. I didn't really feel comfortable doing that, so I just cracked it open just enough to hear him. He said the place isn't open, and I said yeah, I actually just found that out. He then told me that he was stranded. He pointed to the one other car in the parking lot over there, and said his battery died. He practically begged me to come help him jumpstart his car. I told him I don't have jumper cables, and he told me not to worry, he has them in his trunk. I took one more look at his car parked in the corner spot by the woods, and I said okay. I believe in karma, and I knew I'd have bad karma if I left this man stranded in a situation that I could have easily helped him out in. He backed away from the car, so I could pull my car next to his. Since he was parked head in, I did the same to align our hoods as close as possible. I got out from my car after popping my hood. He went to go pop his hood and grab his jumper cables. After we connected the cables to the respective terminals, I started my car again. We gave it a minute before I told him he should go try starting his car. He took his sweet time walking inside, but when he tried starting it, the car didn't start. So we gave it another couple of minutes, and then he tried it again. Still nothing. This was weird considering he had just been driving the car, so his battery shouldn't need that long to get enough of a charge to start again. The guy then asked me to hang on as he walked away and got on his phone. He started speaking in Spanish in a pretty low volume. I can't really understand Spanish, so I wasn't even bothering trying to hear what he was saying. He came back to me after his call and said that his friend said to give it a few more minutes and try one more time. I said okay. I was trying to do the right thing, but I was also hoping this wasn't going to eat up much more of my time. But the last thing I was expecting was hearing the aggressive sound of 2 pickup truck engines flooring it into the parking lot, one from either side of the building. I instantly put it together. I said oh shit under my breath as I removed the jumper cables from my battery and shut the hood in a hurry. But it was too late. The 2 trucks pulled up behind my car, trapping me in. I had to think on my feet. I looked at the man who was still smiling at me, but now the smile looked and felt much more nefarious and evil. The look he gave me was so unsettling, and it's engraved into my memory. I locked my car with my key fob and darted into the woods. I ran in the dark, cutting up my shins and God knows what. I tripped over something on the ground, and at that point I took that as the time to lay down and make myself as tiny as possible. I heard a few men yelling in Spanish somewhere in the woods. I was so scared for my life as the voices got closer. I don't think it gets any more tense than what I was experiencing in that moment. I didn't know how many there were. I didn't know if they were armed, but I heard at least 3 voices. Then the voices started fading away back into the distance, and I felt a sense of relief until the sound of my car alarm going off in the distance. All of my stuff was packed in the back of my car, hundreds of dollars worth of clothes, shoes, watches, bracelets. I started making my way back to the parking lot, crouching down. By the time I got close enough to look into the lot, I could see it was just my car there. All 3 other vehicles were gone. I ran out to my car, and it was anyone's worst nightmare. My rear window was shattered, and all of my stuff was gone. Basically 80% of my entire wardrobe was stolen. My suitcase in the trunk, and all the bags in the back seats. Everything. I actually started to shed tears out of pure stress. I called the police and explained everything. The officers on scene told me they would have to get the CCTV footage from the Wendy's when they opened. After taking all of my info, I was told I didn't need to stay in town, and they would be in touch. I was about 2 hours from home. I turned around and drove home. It was the most stressful, depressing, and defeated drive of my life. To make matters worse, I was contacted by the police department in Jersey, and they told me the vehicle in the Wendy's lot had a fake license plate, and the 2 pickup trucks didn't have plates. He told me they were still going to do what they can, but I knew that was just him trying to give me a sense of hope. My stuff was never found. Those bastards got away with it. Like I said, I believe in karma, and I hope those pieces of filth got what was coming to them. We've all taken a long car trip, haven't we? We've all passed that rest area sign multiple times, wondering if we could make it another 20 minutes or not before having to take a pee break or stretch. Sometimes you're lucky and get one of those huge rest areas with the big buildings with food and everything, but most other times, depending on where you are, you'll be lucky to get a little one with a tiny building just for restrooms and nothing else. Well, I was on a long road trip. A 15-hour road trip, actually, and a big chunk of that drive was overnight. I won't say from where to where because I don't really think that matters much, but I will say that I was in some bumfucking area on the east coast of the US. It was late at night, and I was powering through the drive. Not many cars on the road at this hour. In fact, it was a pretty rare scene to see another car on the road this late. I was reaching that uncomfortable point in the ride where I had to use the bathroom, and I was just getting overall antsy in my seat from sitting for so long. I started keeping an eye out for a rest area sign, and when I saw that familiar blue sign, it felt like a saving grace. So a few miles later, I veered off into the rest area. It was a small one, but there was a restroom building, and that's all I needed. There were no trucks parked here. I'm pretty sure they can only stay overnight at designated truck rest areas, but there was another car in the parking lot. I considered the possibility that whoever it was asleep in their car. As I got out from my car, I stretched a bit, and on my way to the bathroom, I looked at the other car in the lot, but the windows appeared to be tinted, so I couldn't see if someone was inside of it or not. Not that it was a big deal in the moment, I was just curious. I got inside the bathroom, and I was faced with a strange sight. There was a man standing in the corner of the bathroom with his head looking down and his back towards me. At first, I thought he was using the urinal, but I quickly realized he wasn't even facing the closest urinal. He was literally just facing the corner of the wall. I paused, and I didn't know whether to say something or not. I almost said, "Are you alright?" But the scene was just too weird. I had to walk closer to him though to get to the stall, and honestly, I was almost scared to get near him. I just tried to mind my business and keep a normal pace. I walked into the stall and closed the door. Honestly though, I couldn't go to the bathroom with someone else in the room. I'm one of those people. It was just too dead silent in there. It was weird. I stood in the stall for like a minute trying to at least pee, but I couldn't for some reason. I flushed the toilet anyway and left the stall. But now the man had turned around. He was still standing in the same spot, but now he was facing me. I could see his face, and he was looking at me. I'm not one to ever judge someone's appearance, but this man was the scariest looking man I'd ever seen. There was something so unsettling about his face, specifically his eye region. The expression he had was a blank stare. I hadn't had a social interaction in over 10 hours, and this caught me way off guard. Instead of saying anything, I quickly turned and headed out of the bathroom. I got to my car and wasted no time turning it on and backing it up. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw that man walking in the direction of my car. I drove fast away to get him out of my sight. I was relieved to get back on the highway. However, that was the only relief I got. I still had to use the bathroom. I was sure it would only be another 20 minutes or so till the next one. I could hold it. I was right. It was about 20 minutes before I got to the next rest area. It was another nearly identical one as the other. Like I said earlier, most are pretty similar. No cars were in this one, thank God. I pulled into a spot right in front of the bathroom and hurried to the stall. And let's just say I felt a lot better very quickly. As I was finishing up in the stall, I heard footsteps enter the room. I thought they'd stopped at one of the urinals, but the footsteps came straight to the stall and stopped. I saw someone's shoes through the bottom crack of the door. They were literally standing on the other side of the stall. My first thought was that it was that guy from the other bathroom. He followed me. My social anxiety was handicapping me from saying anything initially, until I finally mustered up the courage to say, "Someone's in here." No response to this though. Now I knew I was in trouble. The only thing I could do was dial 911 and put it on speaker so that the man could hear the operator say, "911, what's your emergency?" I said loud and clear, "I'm being followed by a dangerous man. I feel threatened." As the operator asked my location and details, I answered everything in a loud voice, in a tone suggesting that I was implying a fuck you to the man. Thank God this worked, as the person turned and walked out of the bathroom. I told this to the operator, but said I still would feel safer waiting in here until police came, and that's what I did. A knock at the bathroom door from a police officer was my cue to safely come out. I described the man and the vehicle I saw at the other rest area, the creepy encounter, and then the second creepy encounter at this one. We checked my car as well to make sure it wasn't messed with at all. After determining that he was gone, the officer and I left the rest area at the same time, and eventually he turned off the highway. The rest of my road trip went normal, but damn was this a terrifying night. I had never been followed before. I know with almost 100% certainty that the person outside of the stall was the same creep that was in the first bathroom. It just feels extra weird because I'm a male. These things I feel like usually seem to happen to women, but I guess it can really happen to anyone.